Chapter 19, In the Beginning. Darren Grandel groaned as he heard the door to his bedroom creak open. Shutting his eyes tight, he feigned blissful unconsciousness. Hoping he might steal a few more moments of sleep by playing to the sympathy of the one who had come to summon him from his dreams. Briefly, through a single cracked eyelid, Darren saw through the partly drawn curtains that the sun had barely risen. The muted sound of a distant rooster announcing the morning with an exuberant crow, serving to herald the glowing orb's unwanted light. The alarm clock on the oak bedside table had already tried to raise Darren with its scream, and swiftly been silenced by his barely conscious hand. However, his visitor, whose creaking footsteps on the wood floor were easily discernible as they moved to the side of the bed, was not so easily deterred. "Are ye daft, man? Don ye know what time it is?" came a feminine voice with a heavy Feyland accent, that would have been almost lyrical if not so harshly distorted by annoyance. "Too early," came Darren's reply, in a tone of overly exaggerated exhaustion as he covered his head with a pillow. Truth be told, he was already on the verge of full wakefulness, but he could never resist teasing his wife a little. She was absolutely irresistible when she was angry, and when she was happy, and when she was sad, and on any day ending in "why really?" What's more, he knew her reactions well enough to believe he might be able to coax her back to bed for a few moments of snuggling, if he played his cards right. He could almost feel the sly grin on her face as she replied. "Oh? And here I thought I was married ta a soldier, not a slab o' rock. But seein' as how ye are a rock, then you must be sturdy enough ta handle a little tough love. Oh Teresa!" Instantly Darren's eyes snapped open. "Oh no!" was all he had time to think as his wife called out, and he realized he had miscalculated. "Your father's bein' a lazy lump. Get 'im up fair me would ye." Thinking quickly, Darren moved to throw back the sheets, attempting to prove he was in fact awake, and no drastic steps were needed. Only to find his legs were hopelessly tangled in the bedsheets. Gamely, he managed to raise most of his upper body out of bed and open his mouth to protest, before being knocked down again by a red-haired blur wearing a yellow nightgown. "Dotty ye?" the blur shouted, as it ran full force into Darren's broad chest, knocking him flat against the headboard as it wrapped its arms around his center of mass. "Oof!" Darren exclaimed as he just barely avoided having the wind knocked out of him completely. The figure now clinging to his bare chest, turned out to be a little girl of about 12, her long fiery red hair done up in two pigtails. She looked up at her father with a smiling, freckled-covered face, her icy blue eyes sparkling with joy. "Come on, Dad," she cried out with a giggle. "Mom says you gotta get up to make us pancakes." Darren glanced over at his wife with a look of mock reproach. "Oh, she did she?" he asked, with a small smirk as he tousled his daughter's hair affectionately. "Darn right, did. Your breakfasts are the only reason I stay married ta your lazy behind," she declared with a smirk of her own. Darren laughed as he eyed his wife of nearly 15 years. Kira was still every bit as beautiful as the day he first laid eyes on her, her short red hair, that stayed slightly messy no matter how hard she tried, framing a delicate face with bewitching green eyes. Her slender figure, as well as graceful legs and arms, belied her surprising physical strength, and tough as nails personality. She looked like a fairy queen from a children's folktale, but had the personality of a warrior from a saga. And Darren loved her more every time he looked at her. "And here I thought you married me because of my striking good looks and roguish charm." Darren replied back with a wounded pout. "Nah," Kira replied without missing a beat. "That was just a bonus." Darren laughed out loud at that. He would swear Kira could read his mind sometimes, she always knew exactly how to match him quip for quip. "Truly you spoil me with praise, my love," Darren replied. "But I suppose the loyal knight must ever serve his queen and princess. So pancakes it is," he declared with a smile. "Yes," came an enthusiastic squeal from the girl clinging to Darren's waist. "Dad's pancakes are the best." It didn't take long after that for Darren to extricate himself from his daughter's iron grip, and throw on a robe. Following his wife and child down the stairs, he headed through the rustically appointed living room to the kitchen. walking over the polished wood floors and past the painted white wooden cupboards. Darren noted all the ingredients and utensils he needed, had already been placed on the built-in table next to the large stainless steel range stove. Darren grinned. Kira must have set it all up for him the night before without him noticing. Like so many things in their lives, she had planned this in advance. As his daughter and wife set the table, Darren cracked his knuckles in preparation for his task. A gesture he had acquired during his time in the military, and one he always performed when he intended to tackle an especially important job. His movements were precise and measured, as he began mixing the flour, sugar, milk, vanilla extract, eggs and other ingredients together in a large ceramic mixing bowl. He had long ago learned the recipe by heart, and hummed tunelessly to himself as he worked. Without taking his eyes off the bowl, he reached out to turn on the 2 stove burners, above which was placed a cast iron griddle. Flicking his eyes to his right for an instant, he pressed the activation button on the automatic coffee maker, before resuming stirring the mixture in the bowl with energetic but even strokes. "You do make a handsome figure in the kitchen," purred a voice from right behind him, as a pair of slender arms wrapped around his chest. Darren turned his head just in time for his lips to connect with a far softer pair, that eagerly devoured his own. Placing the bowl on the counter, Darren wasted no time in turning to embrace his loving wife, as their lips and tongues continued to wrestle. Finally, however, they parted for air, and Darren was treated to a radiant smile that would have put the sun itself to shame. "Good morning, gorgeous," Kira declared happily, her arms still wrapped around her husband's neck. "Good morning, beloved," Darren replied with a grin, his wife's good humor as infectious as ever. Briefly, Darren reflected that no matter what his mood might be, Kira could always instantly brighten it. "Ooh, you guys are gross," opined a child's voice from off to their side. Darren and Kira laughed as they regarded their daughter, who was partially covering her face with her hands in embarrassment. "Oh, I quite agree, that was simply awful," Darren stated as he leaned in to rub his nose against Kira's. "You really must practice more," he chuckled. Kira smiled, as she gave him a glare of mocked anger. "Well, it's not picnic fair me either, but some of us are tactful and no ta na mention it." She shot back as she gave her husband a kiss on the nose accompanied by a laugh. "Now, back ta work, am gettin' hungry," Darren chuckled as he released her and went back to his cooking. "As m'lady commands," he replied with a smile. Twilight stared at the scene unfolding before her with wondering eyes. In the center of the clearing in which she and her friends and family now stood, surrounded on all sides by the forbidding darkness of the ever-free forest, the figure of Darren Grundle sat in a cross-legged position in front of the massive circular stone monument that loomed over every pony present. His eyes were closed, and his body was utterly motionless, save for the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his armored chest, which was the only visible indication that he was even still alive. On either side of Darren were Celestia and Luna, the princesses of the sun and moon's horns glowed softly, as they fed a steady trickle of power into the spell that held the rapt attention of all present. Manifesting as a large silvery cloud of mist that seemed paradoxically, both opaque and nearly transparent, it was connected to Darren's head by dozens of glittering threads comprised of the same ephemeral substance. The cloud churned and swirled, as the images of Darren's ancient memory played out within its depths. The images were so clear, it was almost as if you could step into the misty projection and interact with them. However, the realism and spellcraft, while impressive, were not nearly as interesting to Twilight as the images themselves. "Is that really Darren?" she asked, almost unable to believe it. Darren's mane was much shorter, styled into what she believed was referred to as a business cut. He looked older, with the faint lines in his face that one associated with those who were just outside of middle age. The most striking difference, however, was his attitude. He seemed less intense somehow. His eyes seemed softer, his posture more relaxed, and the aura of power that seemed to surround him at all times was absent. In addition, while he was still very fit, his body seemed to have slightly less muscle definition, and even a bit of softness here and there. Were it not for the icy blue of his eyes, and the sound of his voice, Twilight could have easily assumed he was somebody else entirely. Indeed. Luna replied, glancing at Darren's seated form with an expression of sorrow. This was Darren as he was slightly over 1200 years ago. Cadence, staring at the projection with no less incredulity than her sister-in-law, was next to speak. So. Then those two are. She trailed off as Celestia nodded. His wife, Kira, and his daughter, Teresa. The solar monarch confirmed sadly. Why does he look older? Asked Rainbow Dash, puzzled. Celestia simply shook her head. The answer to that will come later, for now, simply watch. Every pony present nodded their agreement, as new images resolved in the mist. Showing Darren and his family sitting around a table, their meal almost finished. Seeing Darren, and his wife and daughter talking and laughing, none could imagine a more perfect example of a happy family. It made Twilight wince, as she felt a sympathetic pain in her heart. I hope ye haven't forgotten about your parents arriving today. Kira asked, wiping away the lingering traces of maple syrup from her mouth with a red and white checkered cloth napkin. Of course, they are arriving later this afternoon, correct? Darren inquired, taking a sip from his coffee. Yep, your father called to say he was going to try and make it a wee bit earlier if an E could. Said E had a big surprise for ye. Kira replied as she started to clear the table. I hope it is not another attempt to convince me to take his seat on the High Council. Darren replied darkly. Come now, you know he just wants what's best for ye, Kira scolded from the kitchen. Darren laughed. So you think I should acquiesce to taking the job then? He called back. Returning from the kitchen, Kira wrinkled her nose in disgust. Light above, no, she stated flippantly. I'd go Daft Haven to host those fancy dress parties like your mum does. Not to mention I canna stand the pompous high society speech garbage, with m'lord this and m'lady the, makes my skin crawl. Darren raised an eyebrow. Are you implying that my manner of speaking is unattractive? He asked with a smirk. Let's you say you're lucky ye have such a sexy voice. Kira replied with an impish smile, causing Darren to grin and roll his eyes good-naturedly. I like how you talk, Daddy. Teresa offered up happily, leaving her empty plate to hug her father's arm. Thank you, Princess, I'm relieved someone around here appreciates high-quality linguistic skills, Darren declared imperiously as he lifted his daughter onto his lap. Ah, why your mother could not be as appreciative, I shall never know, he continued melodramatically. Kira, however, smirked as her eyes flicked to her daughter. Oi, your highness, beware of flattery from a smilin' maiden. Following his wife's gaze, Darren saw his daughter steal a syrup-covered pancake off his plate, and hurriedly shove it into her mouth. Old Phelan proverb, Kira declared with a laugh. Darren shook his head in defeat. A fork-tongued devil for a wife, and a silver-tongued brigand for a daughter. Truly I must have sinned mightily in a life past. He remarked with a laugh. Still, he continued, holding Teresa tight as he placed a kiss on her head. I would not trade either for all the power and wealth upon Dunua, Darren declared, with both a smile and tone that bespoke true happiness. Plus. An hour later the table was clean, and Darren stood in the living room wearing his work clothes. A worn red t-shirt and faded jeans, held up with a beat-up leather belt, and a pair of brown leather work boots. Maybe not the peak of high fashion, but comfortable, and well suited for a day of work in the fields or repairing farm equipment. Nearby, Teresa sat at the coffee table on one of the beat-up leather chairs. She wore a light blue dress with white stockings, and was currently drawing with her crayons, her face a mask of intense focus. What are you making, Princess? Darren inquired, moving to his daughter's side. Quickly Teresa responded by throwing herself over her work, blocking it from view. Not till it's done. She admonished, causing her father to smile. Oh come now, just a peek? Darren asked placatingly. However Teresa was adamant, as she shook her head. No. You have to wait, she declared, her tone stubborn in the way that only a child can be. Very well, "Have it your way, I shall be patient," Darren stated, relenting as he went to head for the door. "Love? I am heading out now, I shall see you for lunch this afternoon." Instantly Kira appeared as if by magic from the door leading to the guest room. Dressed in manner similar to Darren's, she wore jeans of a darker blue, and a black shirt, and instead of boots and a belt, she wore sneakers. "Not without saying goodbye properly, you know," she admonished, walking over to him and placing her arms around his neck. Darren grinned as he gave her a chaste peck on the lips. She frowned. "Ye call that a goodbye kiss?" she asked incredulously, and Darren smirked. Grabbing hold of Kira, he swung her into a dip, supporting her with one arm before locking his lips to hers in a searing kiss that made her melt into him. Several long moments passed before Darren placed Kira back on her feet with a smile. I suppose THA's good enough," she declared with a smirk. "You are a cruel woman, my queen," Darren replied with a laugh, as he felt someone grab hold of his leg. "Me next," Teresa declared, staring up at her father with a slight pout. "Of course, princess," he replied with a laugh, picking up his daughter under her arms to gently spin her around, much to her giggling amusement, before placing a kiss on the center of her forehead. Lowering Teresa back to the ground, Darren smiled down at her beaming expression. "I shall return at noon, promise to show me what you were drawing when I do," Darren asked with a smile. Teresa nodded vehemently. "Yep, it'll be all done," she responded happily, her smile never wavering. "I shall look forward to it then," Darren replied, turning to head for the large red painted oak door. Pausing to make sure his wallet and oracle were in his pockets, and his keychain clipped to his belt loop, Darren turned the brass knob and threw the door wide. Only to come face to face with a pair of familiar icy blue eyes. The man who stood opposite of Darren was tall, and strongly built despite his advancing years. Patrician, clean-shaven features, were framed by long hair, thinning on the top, and with a slight curl to it. His hair was once a deep black, but now contained a large amount of gray indicative of his age. He wore a black wool frock coat, that had been left unbuttoned to show the white dress shirt, and dark green vest beneath. Gray high-waist pants covered his legs, terminating at perfectly polished low-heel pointed-toe boots. Around his neck he wore a brown paisley cravat, and under his arm he carried a black silk top hat. He stood on the stoop with right hand upraised, as though just about to knock. "Father." The word left Darren's mouth before he even had time to think about it, in a tone of understated surprise that was neither particularly hostile, nor particularly welcoming. "Son," the man replied, his tone mirroring his child's as he slowly lowered his hand. For several moments the two stared at each other, the abruptness of their meeting having left both unprepared for any more advanced form of greeting, and a palpable tension began building in the air. "I thought you were not arriving until this afternoon." Darren asked the question in a tone of studied neutrality, his expression carefully controlled. The man cleared his throat, in a slightly embarrassed manner before replying. "We decided to depart very early this morning. I heard rumors the king might call a meeting today, and wanted to make certain I was unavailable," he explained, his gaze shifting nervously. "I see," Darren replied, his expression still unreadable. "Oh, for the love of the light, Lehman, he is not going to bite," came a woman's stern voice. The voice was highly aristocratic, and was spoken in the tone of a woman who was not in the habit of taking no for an answer. "And Darren Jericho Grandal, I did not raise my son to be inhospitable to guests, least of all those with whom you share blood." The voice came from a woman exiting the passenger side door of an expensive-looking black auto carriage. Clad in an immaculate blue Victorian dress, that would have been more appropriate for a ballroom than a farm, this woman nevertheless moved with a robust, forceful grace. Her features were as severe as her tone, and displayed the delicate cheekbones and jawline of a high-born lady. Her long silver hair was done up in a tight bun, while eyes of glittering steel gray glared at her son and husband with disapproval. "Mother," Darren said, a distinct note of nervousness in his voice as the woman moved toward the pair. "Don't you mother me, young man," she shot back. "You two repeat this behavior every time we have occasion to visit." Tiptoeing around each other as though afraid of stepping on a landmine, she declared angrily. Now, from the top. I want a proper father-son greeting. Nodding, the two men squared off, each with a faintly frightened look in their eyes. Extending his hand, Darren did as instructed. A joy to see you again, father. Please pardon my surprise at your unexpected, but not at all unwelcome, early hour of arrival. Lehman nodded, gripping his son's proffered hand tightly. A pleasure to see you as well, my son. Forgive me for not informing you of our revised schedule, but I had hoped to surprise you. He replied. Darren's mother nodded. Much better. Now greet your mother with a proper embrace, she declared, her previous severe expression vanishing beneath a warm smile and kindly gaze. Darren returned the smile as he embraced both his parents in a tight hug. Good to see you again, mother, and you, father, Darren declared happily. You too, darling. His mother replied, her tone now as warm as her expression. Now, where is my wonderful daughter-in-law, and my even more wonderful granddaughter? She was answered by a happily screaming red-headed blur shooting past her father to wrap her arms around the older woman's waist. Grammy! Grandpa, she shouted, as she swiftly wrapped her grandfather in a similarly robust bear hug. I'm so happy to see you, Teresa declared joyously. Lord and Lady Grandel, it's grand to see ye again, declared the voice of Kira as she followed on her daughter's heels to embrace her in-laws. Darren's mother returned the gesture of affection enthusiastically, while his father was faintly hesitant, as if he felt slightly uncomfortable with the idea of being welcomed. Oh Kira, rubbish with that lord and lady nonsense, you call us Cynthia and Lehman, or mother and father if it suits you. We are a family. Darren's mother lightly scolded, as she beamed at her daughter-in-law and granddaughter. Speaking of, I trust you two have been keeping my ne'er-do-well son on the straight and narrow. She asked, looking down at Teresa with a wide smile as she and Kira parted from their hug. Teresa nodded happily. We have, Grammy. Daddy made us pancakes today. She happily testified. Kira and Cynthia laughed at that, as Darren raised an eyebrow. How precisely, have I suddenly become a villain in your eyes, mother? Darren asked, a good-natured smile on his face. Cynthia gave her son an imperious look of disapproval. You never call often enough, and you never send us any pictures of our darling grandchild, she declared, and Darren laughed. I call you every week, and send pictures every year at the Feast of Ahriman. He protested. His mother simply shook her head. By what metric did you measure that as sufficient? You should be sending photos at least once a month, and calling at least thrice a week. Honestly, how your poor wife and daughter tolerate your negligent nature I shall never know, Cynthia declared, to the smiles and giggles of Kira and Teresa. We suffer, but he makes up for it a wee bit with his cooking, and he ain't half bad in the field and around the house, Kira agreed in a faintly melodramatic tone, and with a devilish smile. He tries real hard, Grammy, but he puts me to bed way too early, Teresa declared, smiling at the opportunity to join in teasing her father. Darren's mother pretended to look appalled. No, she declared in mock horror, kneeling to place her arms protectively around her granddaughter before glaring at her son in feigned anger. My son, how could you? This simply cannot stand. And to your own daughter no less. Have you no shame? Darren laughed at his mother's performance, placing up his hands placatingly. Peace, mother, peace. I swear, tonight she can stay up as late as she desires. In fact, we can all watch a movie on the holobox tonight after dinner. Will that be sufficient atonement? He asked with a smile. His mother nodded as she rose back to her feet. I suppose that would be up to the lady of the house now, would it not? Kira darling, what is your judgment? Kira gave Darren an appraising glance. I suppose that'll do. If he promises to include some of his famous chocolate chip cookies into the bargain, she declared slyly. Darren laughed as Teresa nodded her head vigorously in agreement. Very well then, if that is the price of expunging my sins, then consider it paid, Darren declared with a bow. I shall be upon the task the instant I return this evening. Kira gave him a grim look, though the edges of her cheeks were twitching, as she struggled not to laugh, before offering a nod evoking magnanimity. "Alright then, we'll be holding you to the," she stated, her grim expression swiftly giving way to a smile. Teresa nodded, grinning from ear to ear. "Yes. Cookies," she cried out happily. Darren's mother nodded curtly. "Well then, now that is properly settled, you men bring in the luggage while the ladies catch up, and not a word of complaint," she ordered. Darren smiled as he gave a slight bow, turning to his father, who had taken the opportunity to place his hat on a nearby hook. "Shall we then, father?" he asked with a chuckle. His father gave a laugh as he responded. "Indeed, woe betide those who disobey the Queen, my son," he said with a smile, as they exited through the door. Heading out into the early morning light, Darren and his father walked down the short cobblestone walkway. Heading for the auto garage parked in the dirt driveway that led to the two-door garage attached to Darren's home. It was a fine vehicle, of a design many decades in the past, but still pleasing to the eye. Having a sleek black body vaguely reminiscent of a bullet or dart, trimmed in reflective silver chrome. "Still driving this ancient relic?" Darren teased as they headed around to the trunk. "Indeed, I have always been a man who enjoys the classics," his father replied haughtily. Lehman Grandel had a deep voice, with the same high-born accent as his wife. It was the voice of a man who, whenever he spoke, even those of power listened. A voice that, even if you had never heard it before, demanded respect and deference. It was a voice of strength, experience, and wisdom, that few would challenge. In fact, to Darren's knowledge, his father's voice had never failed to command instant respect, save from three people: his wife, his son, and his daughter-in-law. Darren shrugged. "I would argue, stuck in the past, but that is merely my opinion," Darren stated as he opened the trunk and grabbed hold of his mother's suitcase. His father chuckled. "It is odd you should choose that particular turn of phrase, as it reminds me I have a gift for you." Darren arched an eyebrow. "Oh? What is the occasion?" "My birthday is several months off, and the Feast of Ahriman is not until winter?" Lehman Grandel gave a mysterious smile as he gestured for his son to wait, and went to open the autocarriage's back door. Darren watched his father with a curious expression, as he pulled out a long box made of beautifully carved and lacquered red mahogany. The box looked incredibly old, despite its excellent condition. Its surface covered with intricately carved flowering vines, and a symbol that gave Darren a jolt, as he recognized it. It was a symbol from one of the most ancient, famous, and mysterious corners of Nurian history. A sword, with an image of a partial eclipse, carved where the handle and crossguard met the blade, the sword itself thrust through the top of a monstrous-looking skull. Darren could hardly believe his eyes. "That is the symbol of the Night Sentinels," he exclaimed in awe. "Their order died out millennia ago. Only a handful of artifacts from them even remain. Where on Nua did you get that?" Darren's father gave a conspiratorial smile, as he handed the box to his son. "As it happens, this is a family heirloom, passed down from an ancient ancestor of ours. Supposedly, he was a member of the Night Sentinels, their High Marshal in fact," Lehman explained. Darren's expression became one of stunned surprise. "You never told me that. Who was he?" Darren asked, incredulous at this revelation. "His full name was Sir William Joseph Blaskovich, of the noble house of Blaskovich. The house fell from grace many centuries after William's death, and eventually married into our own family. If legend is to be believed, he was one of the last High Marshals of the Night Sentinels, and a renowned demon hunter." Darren laughed at that. "Demon hunter?" he asked with a chuckle as he examined the box. It was heavier than it appeared at first glance, and he could feel something shift inside of it slightly. "Surely you jest? Demons are a fairy tale told to frighten children and the blindly religious." His father shrugged. "It was likely just a title, I doubt he ever actually fought demons. Still, he was said to be a peerless warrior, and a strong leader." Here Lehman paused, allowing his son to absorb the information for a moment before continuing. It took a great deal of searching to find this. I had to nearly tear the attic apart. Darren could well believe that, the Grendel mansion was massive, and he doubted anyone knew even half of what was inside it. Lehman tapped the box with his finger. When I saw what was inside, I nearly suffered a stroke. See for yourself. Darren arched an eyebrow in faint suspicion, pausing for an instant, before he moved to undo the latch. It was made of slightly tarnished silver, and was designed in the same shape as the symbol of the Night Sentinels carved into the box. Despite its obvious age, it opened easily with a faint click, as Darren slowly lifted the lid and looked at what the box contained. For an instant, Darren found he couldn't breathe. It was a sword, slightly longer than a longsword, but slightly shorter than a claymore. Made of black steel, there was little ostentation to the weapon. It was simple, functional, yet clearly like no other weapon in the world. The handle was long, wrapped in red dyed leather, and clearly designed to be usable in either one or two hands. The pommel was a loop of steel that looked decorative despite its simplicity, and fully capable of cracking open the skull of a careless opponent. The crossguard was solid looking, each end capped by the same loop as the pommel, a small faintly glowing gem of sky blue at the point where the handle and crossguard met, was one of the few visible nods to ornamentation. As for the blade, it was black steel like the rest, forged to perfection, and without so much as a single scratch or chip on its mirror-polished surface, despite its supposed immense age. Extending from the handle and into the fuller, was a raised section of the blade with a series of ancient Nurian runes, etched in gold, while along the fuller itself was a line of inlaid gold, that seemed almost to glow in the sunlight. This is. Darren couldn't speak as he stood holding the box with trembling hands. You are the only warrior left in our family. I thought it fitting that you have this. The Hellbane, Unmaker. Lehman explained, with a faint smile. Darren felt his eyes nearly pop out of his head, as he looked at the sword. A Hellbane? Our family has a Hellbane. He kept repeating in his head. If Darren wasn't seeing it with his own eyes, he would have said it was madness. In the distant past, wars had been fought over possession of the 10 legendary Hellbanes, entire kingdoms wiped out on the merest rumor that one had been found. Their historical value alone made them priceless, while their mystical qualities made them utterly beyond traditional concepts of value, and now he held one in his very hands. I assume you know the legend about the Hellbanes? Darren's father asked with a chuckle. He was clearly enjoying his son's shock. Of course Darren knew. Even the most poorly educated child on Dua knew the legend of these supposedly all-powerful weapons. Darren spoke like his mouth was on autopilot, his voice a reverent whisper as he recited the basic story from memory. When the light chose its 10 champions to face the darkness, it knew they were too few to fight it with ordinary weapons. However, just as creation was anathema to the darkness, so destruction was to the light. Never had it taken life directly, nor created anything that held the sole purpose of causing harm. Ever had it won against the darkness by strengthening its many children, or healing their wounds. Even when struck, it could never bear to harm an attacker. However, just as rage allowed the darkness to rebel against its nature, so too did the love for its threatened children, allow the light to transcend its own limitations. And in so doing, create the mightiest weapons ever to be used against evil. Darren seemed as if he was completely unaware of his surroundings as he kept talking. It made 10 weapons, indestructible even by the darkness, and each designed to feed on the power of evil. Turning the darkness's own strength against it, and each with the name of a virtue: mercy, justice, repentance, temperance, honor, order, purity, truth, and innocence. However, one weapon was different. Containing power like none other. It was gifted to the champion who ultimately defeated the darkness, and was said to have the ability to completely extinguish evil souls, and so it was named Unmaker. Darren stared at his father in awe. You always were fond of those stories, Lehman said wistfully. Darren shook his head as he closed the lid of the box. Is this truly Unmaker? The Unmaker? Darren asked, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. His father shrugged. I honestly am not certain, I do not dare have it appraised. If it is the genuine article, there'd be no end of brigands and other rabble who would come seeking to steal it. To say nothing of the various idle rich who would come beating down my door begging me to sell it. However, according to our ancestral legend, it is the real Unmaker, the first and mightiest of the Hellbanes. Darren shook his head, as his father cleared his throat. Incidentally, I recommend not telling anyone about it. Just keep it as a conversation piece, and if anyone inquires, tell them I had it commissioned for you by a magesmith in a foreign land. Darren nodded his agreement. A real Hellbane could be traded for rulership of a country, and it would still be considered an amazingly cheap price. Darren shuddered to think what people might be willing to do for this kind of treasure. Of course. Darren trailed off as he glanced at a large granite boulder in a field across the road. Calming as he recalled one of the many stories surrounding the Hellbanes. I wonder. Do you think it is true that a Hellbane can cut through any substance as though it were air? Or erect an invincible aegis of force to shield its wielder? Lehman shrugged. Perhaps, all the other supposed Hellbanes are in museums, or the vaults of various royal families across the world, so no one has tested them in recent memory. But if it is, then maybe it is also true that the only thing it can never cut, is the flesh of the innocent. Perhaps you could set yourself up as a magistrate. Darren laughed at his father's comment, recalling the stories of kings ruling guilt or innocence by striking accused criminals with a Hellbane. I do not think the local constabulary would care for me trying that, he stated with a grin. Thank you, father, this is a truly wonderful gift, Darren stated gratefully. Lehman nodded. I am delighted to hear that. Now I advise we bring in these bags before your mother grows impatient. Darren nodded, closing the ornate box and placing it under one arm. Indeed, I doubt even a sort of godly legend would do much in the face of mother's wrath. He commented with a smile, as he hoisted his mother's suitcase again. His father chuckled as he grabbed the other bag. As the man who has been married to her for nearly 40 years, I can assure you that you would fight very bravely, and fall very swiftly. Laughing, the pair headed back toward the house, the tension of their earlier meeting entirely forgotten. Plus. A short time later, Darren and his father once more found themselves in front of the two-story white-painted colonial building that was Darren's home. As much as he would have liked to stay, Darren still needed to head out to the fields, and Lehman had offered to see him off. There was always something to be done on the farm: plowing, seeding, watering, spraying, harvesting, conducting repairs on something, or just scaring off the occasional deer. Fortunately, today's workload was comparatively light, and Darren was certain everything would be done long before nightfall. Walking to his Terran engine, or tractor, as some lands called it, Darren listened to his father complain about the latest problems on the Royal Council. Half the council are beginning to wonder if the king has gone entirely mad. Lehman groused. He barely attends to the needs of the kingdom anymore, and we are left to handle nearly everything. Then we hear he's emptied half of the kingdom's coffers to purchase various ancient mystical artifacts of very suspect origin and authenticity. And now all these rumors of the king conducting some kind of rituals in secret. Darren's father shook his head. For all the power the king has dumped in our laps, I cannot help but feel as though things are spiraling farther and farther out of control. Darren shrugged. He had never been interested in politics, despite being born into a family of politicians and trained in every aspect of courtly life, speech, and etiquette. As far as he was concerned, if it didn't affect him directly, it didn't matter. Not to seem uncaring, but if the day-to-day running of the kingdom is uncompromised, I fail to see the issue, Darren stated as he placed the satchel containing a small snack in the back of the engine's cab, just beneath the shock rifle he used to drive off deer. His father sighed. Do not feign ignorance, my son, you know as well as I, that a king must project strength, lest other countries begin to wonder if our lands may be fit to plunder, Lehman stated. Darren rolled his eyes. Oh, come now, father, it has been well over a generation since the last war. Our enemies are few, and none are close enough to present any kind of real threat even if they wanted to. Besides, our current king has only held the throne for a few years, This is likely just him still getting used to the job, Darren stated, turning to give his father a reassuring smile. Lehman shook his head. Unlikely, the king was unsettlingly ambitious, until about a year ago, then this started up. And my personal sources have also been bringing me disturbing rumors of their own. Kidnappings, unsavory individuals having audience with the king in great secrecy, and other even darker accusations. Darren shook his head. All of them uncorroborated, I would wager. He commented with a frown. Lehman sighed. Yes. For now? Looking suddenly older than Darren had ever seen him, Lehman's expression became one of bitter resignation. I am not a young man anymore, my son, and it is starting to tell on me. I can no longer command the respect I once did in the council, and the rapid march of progress is beginning to leave me behind. I am, as you said, stuck in the past. Darren's father hesitated for a moment, his tone becoming hopeful. Perhaps, if I could give my position to a worthy successor. Darren let out a sigh of his own, this one of frustration. And so we see the truth of the matter, he stated irritably. We have had this conversation a dozen times, father, and my answer has not, nor shall it ever change. No. Lehman's tone became faintly pleading as he continued. At least consider it. You may not believe it, but you are a superb leader. I know full well that you turned down multiple promotions during your time in the military. You could have been a captain or major if you had wanted. Son, please, if not for yourself then for your people. We need strong leaders. King needs. Enough, Darren shouted, silencing his father with his anger, before calming himself with a deep breath. My answer is no, father, and that is all it shall ever be. Looking his father in the eye he continued. Maybe if King were at war or in some other mortal danger I might consider it, but we are not. Lehman opened his mouth to reply, but Darren forestalled him with an upraised hand. And while I might have the qualifications to lead men in battle, my temperament is ill-suited to helping lead a country. More to the point, however, I have no desire for either, I have no wish to lead or to follow, I only wish to be left in peace with my family. Once more Darren's father attempted to speak but was cut off, his son continuing to speak as he hoisted himself into the cab of his Terran engine, and glared down at his father from the seat. This conversation is over, father, and we shall not be having it again, do I make myself clear? Lehman looked for a moment like he would continue to protest, but then shut his mouth and nodded. He did not want another fight over this. Darren rarely lost his temper completely, but when he did it was nothing short of terrifying, though Lehman could never recall him ever coming to blows with anyone, even in the throes of his most terrible rages. However, more than that, Lehman had no desire to drive his son away a second time, and so he capitulated. Good, Darren said, his voice still slightly tense but his anger already fading. I shall see you this afternoon then, he declared, a note of finality in his voice highlighting that no further argument on the matter would be tolerated. Then with a nod, he closed the cab door and started the vehicle. Twilight and the others stared unblinkingly at the events playing out before them. This was what Darren Grandel, the Doomslayer, the most fearsome warrior to ever live, had been? Now that it had had time to sink in, it seemed almost surreal to many of them. More than a few of the ponies assembled, knew, or guessed, that Darren had had a family, but the feeling of seeing it play out before them was impossible to describe adequately. He seems mostly the same but at the same time he's so different, Caden stated, and the others couldn't help but nod. He seems so much more relaxed. Gentle, even when he got angry there, it was nothing like what I was expecting. Fluttershy commented. Yeah, Shining agreed. Whenever I talk to him now, I always feel this. I don't know, power, coming from him. Like he's a sheathed weapon, that's always ready to be drawn. Whenever I look at him, I'm 100% dead certain that I could never take him in a fight, but looking at him here. Shining shrugged. I just see a regular stallion, no different from any pony else. Rarity nodded as she chimed in. I know what you mean, darling, He always has that look in his eyes like he's seen things no pony else possibly could. And as much as I hate to say it aloud, and as much as I know he does not deserve it, I always feel a bit scared of him sometimes, no matter how hard I try not to be. However, seeing him like this, I don't think I could be frightened of him even if I was inclined to try, she stated. Everpony save Celestia, and Luna, nodded a bit guiltily. They had all felt it at one time or another, the faint sense of fear that Darren sometimes inspired. Not the terror some of them had felt upon seeing him in battle, but rather, a subtle sense that there was something faintly off about Darren. It was most intense when you first met him, and tended to swiftly fade over time to the point where you forgot it was ever there. But every once in a while, something made it resurface. It was always faint, easily ignored, and vanished as quickly as it appeared, but it was still there, this feeling that deep inside Darren, something terrible was lurking. No pony among them could truly label it evil, but it was most definitely not good. Rainbow nodded along with everpony else, as she recalled earlier when Darren had become angry with her. It might have been her imagination, but for just an instant, it had looked like his eyes had changed. In that instant, that feeling of faint fear buried in her subconscious, had exploded, into a single moment of pure terror like none she had ever felt. She considered mentioning it, but decided against it. It might have been a trick of the light, and Darren when he got angry, was scary no matter how brave you were. Whatever it was that inspired these inconsistent feelings of unease, it clearly was not present in the stallion they saw in the misty depths of the spell. What was that thing Darren's parents came in, and that thing he was driving? Rainbow asked, getting the odd premonitory feeling that the question of Darren's occasionally off-putting nature, would be revealed in time. Luna glanced at the images in the spell, temporarily frozen, so they could speak without missing anything. Nua was a world that had achieved a far greater level of technological development than Equestria. Long before Darren was even alive, they discovered a method of fusing their technology and magic together, allowing them to work wonders that even to us, would seem like, well, magic. Those vehicles are one such wonder. They are effectively a chariot that is propelled by magical energy, and were used for everything from agriculture to warfare. She explained. Twilight nodded. Darren mentioned he had a device called an oracle, that he could use to do all kinds of amazing things. She commented. And you all saw the armor that Darren's brothers wore. It too is a product of what they referred to as magical technology or, magetech, for short. Although theirs was made using both equestrian and Denurian magic, Celestia stated. Wait. Twilight responded, giving Celestia a puzzled look. You mean they built that armor while in Equestria over 1,000 years ago? How? She asked, slightly incredulous. The Denurians used magic spells for everything, including the rapid creation and refinement of complex substances from raw materials. As long as they have access to the raw materials, they can fabricate whatever they need, given time. Although, for reasons you will soon see, this was impossible before they reached us. Celestia explained. They really were able to make all the technology from their lost civilization from memory? Cadence asked in amazement. Luna shook her head. Not quite. Several of Darren's more prescient brothers brought along what they referred to as data crystals, magetech crystals the size of a thumb, that can store more information than exists in all the libraries of Equestria combined. The crystals can be read by any mage who knows the proper spell, or by anyone with a proper magetech device. However, after creating their weapons, armor, and supplies, the devices used to create them were hidden, along with the crystals to preserve secrecy. She explained, and despite everything, Twilight felt herself nearly swoon, at the thought of that much advanced knowledge stored away somewhere. However, she swiftly returned to Earth, feeling guilty as she recalled that those crystals were likely all that remained of the culture and history of Darren's homeworld. Which reminds me. Why was all this kept a secret? Twilight asked. Luna gestured back to the illusion, which she and Celestia had kept paused. Let us keep watching, you shall have all the answers soon enough. Pulling away from the house and his father, Darren let out a deep breath as he drove forward. The Terran engine moved at a slow, leisurely pace, its techno-sorceress motor having been designed for power over speed. However, that suited Darren fine, as it gave him a chance to relax by watching the surrounding lush grasslands, and distant abutting forests, roll by. In the distance to his right, Darren could see the foothills that gradually transitioned into mountains, while on his left he could barely make out the far-off silver skyscrapers, and enchanted stone castles, that made up Argent. The capital city of Keemd rose up over the hills and distant forests like a shining beacon. The reflections of sunlight off the chrome and polish, of countless hover carriages, and lifter bikes, making the air around the city seem to sparkle. Much of Keemd was hilly grassland, and relatively flat forest, that combined with how large the capital actually was, allowed it to be seen even from this vast distance. Darren had been to the city many times, both as a child accompanying his father, and an adult to sell his harvest. And while he did enjoy it there among the crowded streets, towering buildings, and honking auto and hover carriages, he much preferred the quiet of the countryside. Closer to hand, Darren could see the center of the town he called home, the center being only a few miles from where he lived. The town of Stalheim was quite small compared to the capital, but still had plenty going for it. In addition to the library, and Church of the Heavenly Dawn, where Darren and his family attended services, there were several very nice restaurants, a hollow theater, various miscellaneous stores, and the Drunken Giant, the bar where Darren and Kira had made a bit of a name for themselves around town, as a karaoke singing duo. Darren smiled as he thought of the many Saturday nights they had spent there to the cheers of the raucous crowd. The road that led to Darren's fields was a gently winding dirt affair, far enough away from the town center that houses became sparse. Most of the land being given over to crop reduction. Glancing over to his left, Darren saw one of his few nearby neighbors, Mr. Cetron, who most would have called a paranoid shut-in. Though, in reality, Darren knew him as merely a grumpy, retired, widower, who simply preferred to be alone. It didn't take long for Darren to reach his fields, several score acres of corn, fruit trees, and various vegetables, as well as a decent-sized patch of melons and squash. It was midsummer, and most of the crops had already begun growing in earnest. Most of today's schedule was about watering and spraying for pests, plus harvesting a few watermelons for the house. Darren smiled as he guided the engine into the gate in the electro-wire fence that surrounded his land, to keep out all but the most determined deer. Pulling his oracle from his pocket, Darren glanced at the display. He had made relatively good time, as it was still only about 8:40 a.m., and he reflected his father hadn't been kidding about getting an early start. Considering the 3-hour journey from the Grandel Manor to Stalheim. Darren frowned. His father. Darren knew Kira was right, and that Lehman Grandel only wanted what was best for his son. However, it frustrated Darren that his father always assumed that meant having power and wealth. True, money was always nice, and he could think of worse things than being one of the most influential figures in Keemd, but somehow the idea never appealed to him. Power and money had a nasty habit of changing people for the worse, and it was a rare man indeed who could say otherwise. Darren's mother was the only person he could think of, whom had never allowed her money or status to change her. Darren suspected that that was the main reason his father had the reputation he did for being such a principled member of the nobility. Darren sighed. He understood his father was worried about both his son and the kingdom, and was simply pursuing what he felt was the best solution to both, but it just wasn't something Darren could do. Darren shook his head. Enough fretting about family matters for now, they would keep till he got back. Retrieving his wireless earpieces from an overhead pocket and putting them in his ears, Darren pulled out his oracle. Holding the palm-sized rectangle of glass and plastic in one hand, he called up the music program and selected one of the soundtracks Kira had made for him, before hitting play, and getting to work. For the next few hours, Darren spent his time spraying anti-pest potion on the corn, before switching to pulling weeds in the vegetable patch. Falling into a comfortable rhythm, Darren sang along to the songs he was listening to, memorizing the words, while he pulled weeds from the ground and threw them into a nearby pile. While he did use herbicidal potions to help keep the weeds under control, there were some particularly tenacious specimens that the potion brand he used wasn't able to counter completely. However, there were so few of these die-hard survivors, that it was cheaper to simply take them out by hand, than to buy a stronger potion. He had considered paying a mage to enchant the field with an anti-weed spell, but that too was a bit out of his price range. Besides, he rather liked doing it the old-fashioned way. There was something innately cathartic about firmly grabbing an unsightly weed, and ripping it free from the earth, before tossing it aside with a flick of his hand. However, just as Darren paused to note that it was approaching noon, and he ought to head back for lunch, something began to happen. A strange chill from out of nowhere made Darren stiffen, a feeling of inexplicable terror jolting him from his thoughts. Whipping his head around, Darren was briefly overcome by a sense of being surrounded by some unseen enemy. Suddenly, the music Darren was listening to was replaced by an angry hiss of static. Snapping out of his daze and pulling his oracle from his pocket, Darren was stunned to see the display was jumping around all over the place, amid a haze of snowy visual interference. Tapping the screen, Darren attempted to get it to respond, but it only seemed to get worse. The light from the screen became an angry red, and Darren could swear he was seeing glimpses of strange symbols, ghosting across it at random. Then without warning, Darren let out a cry of surprise and pain. As what sounded like an inhuman scream, blasted through the audio buds in his ears. Dropping his oracle in surprise, Darren ripped the small speakers from his ears and flung them away. Recovering swiftly, Darren bent down to retrieve his malfunctioning device, only for his eyes to widen as he saw the screen. It was now blazing with crimson light, and clearly no longer capable of performing its original function. Darren took a step back in fear, as he struggled to understand what he was seeing. A face, more hideous than any he could imagine in even his deepest nightmares, seemed to be pressed to the screen of his oracle. As if it were a window to another realm, and the thing inside was attempting to break free. The horrifying visage snapped and drooled, drawing a long sinuous tongue across the screen, leaving a trail of boiling saliva behind. Darren stood frozen, as he tried to comprehend what was going on. Was it a glitch? Not likely, maybe a virus or practical joke by a bored techno-sorcerer. Yes, that had to be it, there was no way this was. Darren's thoughts halted abruptly. His blood became ice, and his heart leapt into his throat, as he stared at the oracle with an expression of horrified disbelief. The face beyond the oracle's screen was staring at him. Darren took a step back, and the creature's eyes tracked the movement, its features forming into a twisted approximation of a smile. Then it opened its mouth and screamed. There was no sound, not really, though there might have been if Darren had still had his earpieces. However, the effect was no less dramatic. In a flash of light, Darren's oracle exploded with an echoing bang. Darren flinched, his cheek suddenly stinging, as what must have been a small piece of glass from the burst screen grazed his face. Instinctively, Darren brought his hand to his injury, his fingers coming away red. Standing there with a dumbstruck expression on his face, Darren suddenly became aware of something even more disturbing. Despite the fact that the sky was completely clear, the area was suddenly growing darker, as if a cloud had passed before the sun. The darkness deepened, and a low rumble like distant thunder caused the air to tremble. Darren shook his head and started to move toward his parked Terran engine. Whatever was going on, he needed to get home, now. However, no sooner had that thought entered Darren's head, than a sound like the roar of the darkness itself tore through the air. Darren was thrown from his feet by a force akin to being hit by an out-of-control autocarriage. A new sound, like all the screaming souls of the accursed wailing together, was heard. A howling wind carried the smell of rotting diseased flesh to Darren's nostrils, and he struggled not to vomit. Then, without warning, Darren screamed. It felt as though his entire body, inside and out, was burning. Yet it was not physical pain alone that made him give voice to his agony. Inside Darren's head, he could hear thousands of voices, screaming, roaring, bellowing in a language that he could not understand, yet filled him with a penultimate terror. A sensation like ethereal claws tearing at his soul, nearly made Darren bite his tongue off. As he rolled around in the dirt, screaming as he clawed at his head. Had it not been for the thought of what might befall his family, should he fail to come home, Darren would undoubtedly been broken, mind, body, and soul, by the pain. As it was, however, he managed to grit his teeth against the physical and spiritual torment, holding on to his sanity with all his strength. Then finally, mercifully, the pain ended, as unconsciousness took him. How long Darren remained in that state of senseless repose, he could not have said, but when at last he opened his eyes, he beheld what could only be called Armageddon. His first glimpse of the transformed world from his prone position was the sky. Roiling clouds as black as coal, and backlit by an unholy scarlet radiance, stretched unbroken to the horizon in every direction. Strikes of unnatural crimson lightning played across the constantly moving cloud cover, as thunder that sounded like the roar of some mountain-sized beast, reverberated through the air. The temperature seemed at once, both freezing cold, and boiling hot. The air carried a carrion stench that was a revolting mix of sulfur, rotting meat, and spilled blood, and every breath was like sandpaper in Darren's lungs. Forcing himself to rise, Darren felt his mind rebel against what he beheld. The world beneath the unearthly sky was a ruin. Every plant was a dull lifeless gray, and as Darren accidentally brushed against a nearby squash vine's leaves, it exploded into a cloud of dust. The entire plant, having become nothing more than a sculpture of unliving ash. The trees were much the same, blackened husks of carbon, devoid of leaves, and which burned with fires of unnatural intensity and brightness. Even the earth itself had become a corrupted ruin, with splotches of soil looking disturbingly as though they had been turned to living flesh, and various rocks having acquired the color and texture of long dead bone. Standing amid surroundings that resembled nothing so much as a lunatic's nightmare, Darren felt his mind go blank. What? What is this? He asked aloud, his voice little more than a frightened whisper. Darren's body felt numb, wanting nothing more than for this to be a nightmare. To pinch himself, and wake up in his bed next to Kira, knowing everything was all right. That thought sent a jolt like lightning through Darren's body, and suddenly he felt his mind focus on a single terrible realization. His family was in the middle of all this. And he was not with them. Instantly Darren felt his old soldier instincts take over, his terror departing as his focus cleared, and training took over. He now had a mission, one whose importance purged the horror of a moment ago from his mind completely. He did not have the luxury of giving in to fear, and he did not have time to contemplate the horror surrounding him. He had only his objective, all else was meaningless. Now fortified with purpose, Darren set his jaw, and began to move. Turning to look at his Terran engine, Darren felt a momentary flare of despair, when he saw it was out of commission. Laying on its side with the engine blown out and smoldering. Darren ignored the feeling of panic that was threatening to overwhelm him, fighting the sensation down with an effort of will. His family did not have time for him to be afraid, and so he must not be. Climbing up on top of the useless wreck, Darren wrenched open the door to the cab, pulling his shock rifle from its mounting and checking the charge. Mercifully, it was still in working order, its MageTech components apparently hardy enough to have survived whatever terrible magic had done this. Having retrieved the weapon, Darren grit his teeth, and set off at a jog toward the road, resisting the urge to sprint with a supreme degree of self-control. He couldn't afford to exhaust himself, as he had a terrible feeling that there was more in this wasteland than fire and ash, and he would need to be ready. Reciting a prayer to the light under his breath, he set out through the nearby cornfield, the plants disintegrating as he moved through them, and swiftly coating him in gray powder from head to toe. A small part of him wondered why he had survived when so much else had not, but he ignored the thought. A soldier does not question, he simply moves toward the objective and accomplishes the mission. The trip to the road took only about 5 minutes, but still felt frustratingly long. Darren prayed that Kira and his parents had the good sense to stay put in the house, with the doors bolted. He didn't dare allow himself to think about how long he might have been unconscious. Such thoughts would accomplish nothing other than to slow him down. Finally reaching the road, Darren gained a cleared view of the surrounding country, and felt his guts turn momentarily to water as he looked toward the capital. Despite a distance of over 50 miles, Darren clearly saw what could only be the origin point of this nightmare. A pillar of swirling red energy blazed up from the center of the city, punching a massive hole in the twisting clouds above. The charnel beam must have been over a mile across, and taller than any mountain on the planet. Great forks of incandescent scarlet lightning arced out from it, to touch down many miles away, carving molten trenches into the dying earth. Judging by what he knew of the layout of the capital city, Darren calculated the epicenter to be right above the royal palace. Darren stared at the unspeakable pillar in horror, as he considered what his father had mentioned to him earlier that day, about the behavior of the king. However, before Darren could devote any more thought to the subject, he was pulled back to reality by the sound of gunfire. The volume and direction of the shots seemed to indicate the sound was coming from Mr. Cetron's place. Darren started to jog in the direction of the shots, but then slowed. Did he really have time for detours when his family might be in danger? Another shot, followed by a very human scream of pain, made the decision for him, and he took off at a dead run towards Cetron's home, turning his shock rifle's output to its maximum setting. Reaching the house, Darren slowed, holding his weapon so that it was pointed at the ground, but could be brought to firing position at a moment's notice. As he scanned the outside of the building for hostiles, he lamented the fact that he didn't have a better weapon. Shock rifles were perfect for driving off deer, or incapacitating a human, but even at max power, were unlikely to do more than knock someone out. Still, it was better than nothing, and Darren advanced toward the front door with a sense of grim determination. Normally Darren would have tried to find a back way in, hoping to gain the element of surprise, but that would take time, and the door would likely be locked. Based on what little he knew of his shut-in of a neighbor, Darren advanced on the single-story house, the outer structure curiously untouched by the blight around it, save for a few scorch marks. Darren moved along the side the built-in garage was on, ensuring he was out of view of any windows. Then, flattening himself against the wall, Darren made his way, swiftly but quietly, toward the front door, ducking low whenever one of the darkened windows appeared. Reaching the front door, Darren found a disturbing scene. The large painted oak door had been literally torn apart, with pieces of its splintered remains having been scattered around the frame. Ducking his head into the empty frame for an instant, Darren could see the rest of the door's pieces, as well as a toppled side table, and a smashed vase that had been filled with dried flowers, now scattered across the floor of the entranceway. Taking a deep breath, Darren checked his weapon one final time before calling out. "Mr. Cetron. This is Darren Grandel, your neighbor. I heard shots, can you respond?" Darren had done more than a little search and rescue work during his military service, and when dealing with rescuees who might be armed, it was best to let them know you were coming, rather than surprise them, lest you become a casualty of friendly fire. In this case it meant giving up the element of surprise completely, but if there was no response, it still gave Darren the option of backing off. As it happened, he didn't have long to wait, before the rasping, pain-filled voice of an older man replied. "I'm in the kitchen. Hurry?" Darren called out a quick acknowledgement as he entered the house. Heading through the entryway, Darren moved into a short hall, and had to exert every iota of his willpower not to cry out in alarm, as he made contact with what could only be the enemy. The thing lay crumpled on the floor, leaking foul-smelling blood through a hole in its upper torso. The size of the hole, and splatter of blood on the destroyed wall next to the creature, suggested a shotgun blast had been responsible for its death. The creature had smooth, light brown skin, that transitioned to dark purple around the hands, mouth, and stomach. Its face was extremely angular, with bony spines atop the head, and bony plates surrounding the mouth, and extending down on either side of the chin. Its hands had 3 powerful-looking clawed fingers, while its feet ended in misshapen lumps of flesh, that were neither feet, nor hooves. Even in death, the monster exuded an aura of malevolence that made Darren sick just being near it. He could only imagine how much worse it would have been, if the unholy thing had still been alive. Ignoring the millions of questions running through his mind, Darren refocused on his mission, advancing deeper into the house. As the hallway ended, Darren found himself in a large space that answered for a living room. The walls were decorated with old paintings, and a hollow box in an armoire that was positioned in front of a pair of couches and wooden coffee table. A groan of pain directed Darren to a door to his left as the path to the kitchen. Hugging the wall, Darren called out again. "Mr. Cetron." "It is Darren, I am coming in," he said, before waiting for a reply. The response was swift, and uttered with what sounded to be considerable difficulty. "I heard you the first damn time. Don't worry, I'm not in any condition to shoot you, even if I wanted to." Taking a deep breath, Darren entered the room. There on the floor, his back propped against the refrigerator, was Mr. Cetron. He was about the same age as Darren's father. Bald, but with a shock of white hair surrounding the sides and back of his head, his face was heavily lined with age, and his small mouth was drawn up into a grimace of pain. His brown eyes glittering behind half-moon spectacles. He wore brown faded work pants, and a stained, white dress shirt. Next to him on the tiled floor, was a double-barreled shotgun, and his hands were holding a blackened hole in his gut. Nearby, another of the creatures Darren had seen in the hall, lay dead, half its head splattered across the white and black tiled floor. Ignoring the dead monstrosity with considerable difficulty, Darren knelt by Mr. Cetron and began attempting to administer what aid he could. But as he bent down to examine the wound, Cetron feebly slapped his hands away. "Don't bother," he hissed through gritted teeth. "We both know I'm not walking away from this." Darren opened his mouth to argue, but was cut off as Cetron continued. "Save it, that thing hit me with some kind of fire spell, damn near burned a hole right through me," he gasped. "What? Are they?" Darren asked, glancing over at the nearby corpse with a look of controlled revulsion. Cetron scoffed. "Son, do I look like I know what they are?" he snarled, before beginning to cough violently. A trickle of blood leaked from the corner of his mouth, and a few moments passed before he could speak again. "All I know is, they're strong as a grizzly, and 10 times as mean. Look! I don't have much time, so listen. I'm guessing you're trying to get home, so you should know, these things came from that same direction." Darren felt his chest seize up at that information. It must have shown on his face, because Cetron's expression softened. "Yeah. So I'm thinking, if that's where you're heading, you need more in that little pea shooter you got there." Jerking his head to the left, he drew Darren's eye to the shotgun on the floor, grimacing in pain at the movement. "Take old Bessie there. You'll find extra shells in my pocket. And a few more in the drawer in the coffee table." Darren nodded, picking up the shotgun and ejecting the spent shells inside. With almost indecent haste, he managed to pull 4 shells from the old man's pocket, reloading his newly acquired weapon with practiced ease. Cetron made no sound, save for his breathing, which was growing more labored with each passing second. Standing, Darren looked down at the dying old man, feeling ashamed as he placed his shock rifle on the ground next to Cetron. A feeble replacement. And they both knew it. Cetron chuckled slightly as he saw Darren's expression. "Stop weeping." "Over what?" "Can't be." "Saved," he gasped out, the light rapidly leaving his eyes. "Only sinners." The old man was unable to finish, as he suddenly became very still. After a moment, Darren brought his hand over the old man's face, closing his eyes for the last time. Then, turning away, Darren headed to the living room. Opening the coffee table drawer, and blinking away tears, Darren struggled to keep from shaking, as he recalled the old military proverb Cetron had intended to recite, "Only sinners can survive in hell." Darren left Cetron's house at a dead run. After hearing the old man tell him of the monsters coming from the direction of his family, no force on Nua could have persuaded him to go slower. The only concession he made to sensible tactics, was to run along next to the road, rather than on it, and to stick to what little obscuring cover he could still find. New unearthly sounds filled the air as Darren ran. Inhuman howls, roars, and snarls, as well as the distant sounds of gunfire, and undeniably human screams of fear and pain. Darren prayed to the light as fervently as he ever had, struggling with all his mental fortitude to ignore the fear building inside him. All around Darren, the world was changing into the definition of a nightmare. The ground was looking less and less like soil and rock, and more like bone dust and raw meat. The air stank like rotting flesh and sulfur, and Darren could swear he heard the whispers of unearthly voices, just on the edge of audibility. In the clouds above, amid flashes of unholy crimson lightning, he swore he saw monstrous faces leering down at him, either grinning with malevolent cruelty, or roaring with primal rage. Darren paused, seeing a trio of shuffling figures milling around on the road, backlit into shadows by a burning tree, and apparently uncertain as to where they should go. Thinking they might be fellow survivors, Darren raised his hand to call out a relieved greeting, but it died in his throat as he got closer and saw the truth. The monstrosities before him were vaguely proportioned like men, but other than that minor detail, they could scarcely have been less human. Long, disproportionate limbs supported the twisted misshapen things, whom looked like warped mummified humans that had been fused with a broken bone carapace. Cracked and yellowed by age, the carapace hung from the creatures' bodies at odd angles, the flesh surrounding them the dirty red of exposed muscle caked with ash. Groaning softly, the creatures began to shuffle toward Darren with a slow, jerky gait. Darren raised the shotgun to his shoulder and fired without thinking. The weapon gave a roaring boom, as it bucked in Darren's hands, and one of the lurching abominations lost its head in an explosion of gore, spraying its fellows in dark blood and gobbets of brain. However, the monsters seemed oblivious, as they continued inexorably forward. Their eyeless faces never glancing away from their target. Darren felt his bile rise as he emptied the weapon's other barrel into the second of the three, sending its arm flying off in a puff of red mist and fragmented bone. The creature apparently felt none of this as it continued to move forward, and Darren wondered if it was because it couldn't feel pain, or because the creature was already in so much pain that the loss of an arm simply didn't faze it. The creatures had a tortured, broken look to them, but rather than making them seem sympathetic, it somehow only made them more loathsome. Moving backward, Darren struggled to remain calm as he reloaded. However, abominable as they were, it wasn't just the creatures that made Darren's hands shake to the point of dropping the first pair of shells he pulled from his pocket. Nor was it what made him decide he didn't have time to reload, and flip the shotgun in his hand so that it could serve as a club, ignoring the painful heat of the recently fired barrel. All Darren could think about, as he charged the two remaining monstrosities, was that his family was running out of time. Screaming out in frustration and anger, Darren hit the first zombie-like creature hard enough that its head seemed to fold around the butt of the gun before bursting like a melon hit with a sledgehammer. However, Darren's improvised club was simply too heavy to control properly, and he overbalanced. Forced to let go of the weapon or lose his footing, Darren stumbled as he dropped the shotgun, and the one-armed undead horror was instantly upon him. Raking him across the chest with its claw-like fingers, shredding his shirt, and forcing a cry of pain from Darren's throat. As scrawny as the skeletal thing looked, it was surprisingly strong, and while the cuts it inflicted had not been deep, they burned like they were coated in a combination of acid and salt. Falling back on his hand-to-hand training, Darren grabbed the creature's remaining wrist, and twirled into its body, positioning its extended arm over his shoulder so that the elbow rested on it. Then, he pulled the creature's wrist down as hard as he could with both hands. There was a loud snap, as the creature's arm broke at the elbow, or more accurately, broke off at the elbow. Stumbling forward with half the monster's left arm, Darren tossed it away in disgust, as he turned to face the undead thing. Despite the removal of two of its limbs, the creature was still fanatically intent on Darren's death. Lunging forward, the monster bit and snapped, attempting to rip out Darren's throat with its teeth, as he struggled to hold it at arm's length. Shoving the ghastly thing to the side with a surge of effort, Darren rushed toward his fallen shotgun, wondering at the undead thing's resilience. Turning to face the monster, Darren found it had fallen, but even without arms, was struggling to rise and continue the fight. Kicking its partially risen form to the ground once more, Darren brought the butt of his gun crashing down on the back of the vile thing's skull again and again, until finally, it lay still for good. Darren fell to his knees, shaking from head to toe and panting like he had just run a marathon, as adrenaline surged through him. For a short time, Darren knelt there, struggling to maintain his grip on his sanity. The magics of Dua extended to things like necromancy, and Darren had read of the soulless automatons such magic could create, but these things were different. Creating a zombie was little different from creating a robot. It was simply an empty shell, animated by mystical force and programmed to perform a task. The creatures Darren had just killed, however, were not empty. Darren could not have said how he knew, but he was certain that despite their twisted exterior, these creatures possessed a soul. They were mindless, but it was the kind of mindlessness that came from a being who is put in so much pain, that the mind simply falls apart. Darren had no idea how he could be so sure of any of this, but he was. Rising to his feet, Darren forced himself to focus. Pulling a pair of shells from his pocket and reloading his weapon, Darren once more began running toward his house. He encountered no more monsters directly, but several times he noticed them in the distance. Towering ebon-skinned brutes, misshapen humanoids like the ones who had killed Mr. Cetron, floating orbs of red flesh with giant maws of razor-sharp teeth, more shuffling undead, and other abominations too terrible to describe. None of these sighted horrors were close as far as his cursory glances could tell, but that would not last. Darren idly wondered if these creatures had any form of leader. As far as he could discern, the creatures were acting more or less randomly. Yet at the same time, they seemed to be moving as one. Darren hoped it was his imagination. He didn't want to think about the possibility that the monsters he saw might be intelligently led. If they were, then he feared no force on Dua could stop them. Darren forced himself to stop thinking about the subject. Right now his only concern should be. Darren's thoughts came to a screaming halt as he finally reached his destination. And saw that the door to his home had been broken down. Darren was running before he even thought about moving. His mind was in disarray, and everything seemed to slow down around him. Every stride felt like it took an eternity, as if he was moving through waist-deep mud. Darren was suddenly acutely aware of the impact of his footfalls reverberating through his body. Every breath he took was like inhaling fire, but he was strangely numb to the pain, only able to acknowledge that it was there, and nothing more. In his head Darren counted the amount of distance that remained before he reached the door, the mantra serving to keep him moving. 25 feet. 20 feet. 15 feet. He was now close enough to smell burning hair and charred pork. 10 feet. He could hear the sound of something snarling, in a way that no man or animal possibly could. 5 feet. Darren could make out the sound of clawed feet moving atop a wood floor. 0 feet. Darren arrived, to the sum of all his fears. Darren moved automatically, his hand strangely steady as he raised the shotgun. The world continued to move in slow motion, as Darren took in the scene surrounding him. Before him, 2 living specimens of the creatures that Mr. Cetron had killed, rose from the meal they had been enjoying. In the hand of the first, the pale, lifeless, blood-spattered forearm of an older woman was clutched. The perfectly manicured nails miraculously undamaged, and the heirloom wedding ring her husband had given her, still in place on the middle finger. The creature opened its gore-stained mouth, to let out a keening snarl. As Darren blew its head from its shoulders. Turning smoothly, an unfeeling numbness having placed him beyond fear or fury, Darren aimed at the chest of the second monster. This one had been hurt. A deep cut across its face, still dripping blood and ichor, having been slashed by Darren's old service saber, that had been wrenched from its original position over the fireplace by the monster's victim, whose body still clutched it in one hand. A mute testament to a father, and grandfather's, desperate attempt to save his family. This creature shrieked as it cast aside the item it had clutched in its claws. An ovoid object, covered in crimson gore, but that still retained, even in death, its piercing blue gaze. The monster raised its hands and a glowing red mode of energy appeared between them, swiftly expanding into a ball of flame. A ball that vanished in a puff of acrid smoke, as its creator's chest was poured out in a storm of blazing lead pellets. With an unfeeling expression of shock frozen on his face, Darren moved toward the stairs. And the figure who lay at their foot. His hands moved automatically to reload his weapon as he approached, his mind continuing to swim through a haze of numbness. The figure before him looked up with green eyes that still held the barest echo of life. Her face, arms, and chest, were covered in deep claw marks, through which the white of bone could be seen. Half her bright red hair had been burned away, the skin beneath charred black, cracked, and weeping blood. She was in pain that would have killed anyone else, but stubbornly she still clung to her last vestiges of life. And spoke. "Lehman and Cynthia. Tried to save us," she gasped out, every word a near Sisyphean battle to stave of the darkness closing in about her failing body, by sheer unyielding force of will. "Cynthia? Told us. Ta run. Upstairs. Teresa." She could say no more, but no more was needed. As Kira Grandel gave a final sigh, and closed her eyes, Darren thundered up the stairs. Reaching the upper landing, the world once more moved around Darren at a snail's pace, as every fiber of his being screamed in desperation that he needed to go faster. No longer numb, Darren felt a fear like none he had ever experienced. Every molecule within his corporeal form surged with primal terror and desperation, as he turned down the short hall that led to his daughter's room. The corridor was short, but seemed to stretch out into infinity, as he saw that the door on the end had been broken off its hinges, and now lay across the floor covered in bloody claw marks. Darren roared internally as he struggled to go faster, praying to any god that would listen to help him, as he ran into the room. Apart from the broken door, the room was almost exactly as it had been when Darren and Kira had first decorated it so long ago. A twin-sized bed stood in one corner of the room, its pink and white bedspread unmade since the awakening of its occupant that morning. Soft, sky blue wallpaper, covered with scenes of frolicking fairies, unicorns, and brightly colored butterflies, covered all four of the walls. A large white dresser stood in the corner, a lamp on top of it along with a few errant books full of children's stories. Not far from the dresser, was a white vanity table with a multitude of built-in drawers, and a large mirror bordered with an enchanted light strip. Directly in front of the mirror was a music box Darren had bought for Teresa when he was in the city. All of this entered Darren's mind for only an instant, before his gaze focused on the pair of snarling creatures, that had turned away from something in the closet on the other side of the bed, to face him. The first creature jumped over the bed, claws outstretched toward Darren, only to be blown out of the air and into the far wall, crumpling into an oozing pile of bleeding meat. The other, however, managed to reach Darren, slashing at him with red-stained claws. Blocking the blow with the shotgun, Darren let out a savage roar, as he kicked the monster in the gut. The creature barely seemed to feel the blow, but was knocked off balance, giving Darren just enough room to swing his weapon up to his hip and fire. The gangly creature screamed in agony, as its stomach was blasted through its spinal column in a gout of crimson. Leaving the miserable thing to die in a pool of its own rancid blood, Darren leapt over the bed to stare at what was in the closet, and felt his world turn to dust. There she was. His little girl. Who loved the color blue, because that's the color blue birds are. Who chased butterflies in the summer, but never caught them because she just loved them too much to ever catch them. Who waved to strangers because they were just friends she hadn't met. Who was his whole world. There she was. With her stomach torn open. No. Darren's voice was a pleading whisper as he dropped to his knees, the shotgun falling from unfeeling fingers. No, please. Darren's hands shook as he brought them up to Teresa's face, and held them an inch from her cheek, terrified to touch her. Please, light, not her. Not my baby girl. Daddy. The voice was like a punch to Darren's gut, as Teresa's icy blue eyes looked up at her father's own pair. Her expression resembling that of one who had just awakened, and was still half asleep. Yes, baby, it's me. It is all right, I am here. Don't worry, we can find you help. We can fix you. Had he been in his right mind, Darren would have known his words for the lie they were. But at that moment, he needed to believe, had to believe, that there was hope. Daddy. Teresa's voice was so soft now it could barely be heard, and what little light could be seen in her eyes, was like the last dying ember of a once mighty bonfire. Yes, baby. What is it? Darren asked, sounding hysterical, and forcing a smile to his face, even as bitter tears of denial flowed freely from his eyes. Teresa's eyes became unfocused, her voice barely a whisper. "They're crying, Daddy. Please, they need you. Help them." Darren's tear-stained expression became one of confusion. Who is crying, sweetie?" Darren asked, his confusion momentarily overriding his mounting despair and disintegrating sanity. As, with the last of her strength, Teresa shifted her head ever so slightly, to look over her father's shoulder. "They are," she stated, the words as clear as if she had shouted them, despite being spoken in a whisper. Darren turned to glance over his shoulder. There on the wall, was one of the paintings Kira had done back when they first decorated the room. It was originally a unicorn, standing in a field, its head held high, with its horn pointed proudly at the sky. White coat shining in the sun, while the wind blew through its mane. However, for some reason, Kira had added wings to it. Great white pinions, that stretched proudly to the ceiling. When Darren had asked why she had put wings on a unicorn, Kira had replied that it had just felt right. Now however, the image was a mess. Splattered with blood and damaged by errant buckshot, though it was still clearly discernible. Durand stared at the picture, confusion writ large upon his features. I don't understand." Darren's words died in his throat as he turned back to Teresa. Her eyes were still open, but the faint spark of life they had contained was gone. Darren felt the world, and his mind, convulse. No. No. Darren repeated desperately, as he took hold of his daughter's shoulders. "No, please." Darren pulled his daughter to his chest as he screamed out. "Someone help me." At that moment, Darren pleaded to every god, monster, and hell-spawned abomination he had ever heard of, promising them anything, from his familial wealth to his own immortal soul. If they would only help his child. But no matter how much he begged, no matter how much he prayed, the only answer he received was silence. Darren screamed, his voice a pain-filled wail that can only ever be produced by those whom have been consumed by utter and complete despair. As he knelt there, cradling his daughter's body in his arms, Darren felt himself fall into a sea of utter darkness. There was no up, no down, no direction at all. Only endless, pitch black, nothingness. Darren floated there in that abyss for what might have been either seconds, or centuries. Feeling nothing but emptiness, in a world without sight, or sound, or memory. And then he heard it. Snarling growls, and the creaking clicks of clawed feet ascending the stairs. Darren heard it as if from an unfathomable distance. And deep within him, something broke. Darren Grandel did not move. He heard his voice roar out in a way that no human should have the ability to do. He suddenly once more could see the world from the depths of the abyss through a haze of red, as he placed Teresa's body on the ground. And he watched from the void of despair, as he grabbed his shotgun, and rose to his feet. His body stood, reloaded his weapon, and raised it smoothly to his shoulder, just as two more of the flame-conjuring horrors burst into the room. Darren knew his body was doing all of this. But he himself was not moving. And when his body spoke, it was in a voice he did not recognize. "I'll kill you all," it roared. And so it did. Darren's body emptied the shotgun's two barrels so quickly, that had Darren's consciousness not known better, he would have sworn the targets died in perfect unison. As the bloodied corpses fell to the ground, Darren's body saw another two of the creature's fellows shove their way through the door. There was no time to reload, and no shells left even if there had been, but it hardly mattered. Tossing the shotgun into the air, Darren's body caught it by the barrel, charging forward as he did so, with a speed far greater than any Darren would have thought his body capable. With a roar of insensate fury, Darren's body brought the butt of the gun down on the head of the next monster with enough force to shatter the wooden stock, even as the creature's head was reduced to a spray of brains and blood. Darren's body did not relent as it cast aside the broken shotgun and charged the next of the yellow-eyed horrors, grabbing its neck and bearing it to the ground, as it let out a screeching sound that may have been surprise. Pulling back its fist, Darren's body did not hesitate to bring it down onto what passed for the flailing creature's face. Flesh split, bone cracked, blood sprayed, eyeballs burst, and fangs shattered. As who or whatever was directing Darren's body, meted out a brutal retribution. Hearing a soft roaring sound, Darren's body rolled out of the way of a blazing fireball with preternatural agility, before focusing its red-tinged gaze on the creature standing at the end of the short hall. The monster's clawed hand smoking faintly as it charged up another ball of flame. Letting out another wrathful bellow, Darren's body charged the final monster with reckless abandon. Reaching the creature, it grabbed both of the monster's thin spindly arms in its hands, pulling them aside as it placed its booted foot to the creature's chest and pushed with all its newfound might. For an instant, the monster screamed, its arms straining as Darren's body pulled its upper limbs in one direction while pushing its torso in the other. Darren's body's eyes narrowed in fury. "I'll RIP. His body snarled, as it tightened its grip on the monster's wrists. "And tear you apart." Darren's body bellowed, as with a final effort and a sound of snapping bone and tendons, it tore the monster's arms from their sockets in a spray of wine-red droplets. Deep within the depths of his own mind, Darren watched his body continue its rampage, as it tossed aside its most recent victim's limbs, and jumped down the staircase, landing on one knee in the living room. There, his body paused briefly to take in the scene before it. A new monstrosity had entered the house. It was at least 7 feet tall, its head brushing the living room ceiling as it turned toward Darren's body. It had an almost scaly, coal-black hide, stretched over a bulging musculature. It stood on legs that bent backward and ended in large 4-toed feet that resembled a dog's paws. A head with a plate of white bone in place of eyes, snarled at the force directing Darren's movements, as it flexed massive clawed hands. The creature looked like it was capable of ripping a man in half with ease. The consciousness controlling Darren's body didn't care. Charging at the black-scaled giant, Darren's body actually managed to get within the monster's guard. Whether the creature was surprised by the audacity of a mere human attacking it, or was simply too clumsy to respond inside the confined space of the house, none would ever know. But Darren's body lost no time in striking the creature in the gut with all its might. However, despite now enjoying greater strength than he should ever have been capable of, Darren's fist did nothing more than knock the creature back a step. For just a second, the ebon scale titan seemed genuinely surprised, readjusting its footing as it took another step backward, but it did not hesitate long. With a roar that shook the house to its foundations, the giant sent Darren's body flying across the room with a backhand strike. Had the entity or force controlling his body not jumped back at the last second, the strike likely would have broken one or both of Darren's arms. Even so, Darren's body landed heavily atop a coffee table, reducing it to kindling as the skull-faced beast advanced to finish the job. Roaring out its defiance, Darren's body struggled to right itself, knowing it had but scant moments before it was torn apart. As its hands struggled to find purchase in the ruins of the coffee table, Darren's body felt its palm touch something smooth and cool. Out of options, and as the monster before it raised its massive fist for a final strike, the newly formed consciousness inside Darren closed its hand around a leather-wrapped handle, and with a final shout of rage, swung its arm in a wide arc before it. For an instant, it appeared that the 7-foot monster had escaped injury, as it stood frozen in place, towering over Darren's prone body with one arm upraised. Then, with an almost dignified slowness, its body split from shoulder to waist, into 2 neatly severed halves that fell wetly to the ground, before, with a faint crackling sound, turning into a pile of ash. Plus, outside Darren's home, several dozen monsters of varying shapes and sizes advanced on the structure. Drawn by the roars and screams within, the monsters hungered for fresh prey. The scent of despair and pain poured from the location like blood from a wound, and the monsters salivated at the thought of mortal flesh and souls seasoned with these exotic spices. The smaller ones, the gangly brown and purple-skinned fire conjurers, screeched and keened, as they ran ahead with a swift hopping gait. While the larger black-scaled horrors advanced with a lumbering stride, supported by a pair of massive, sedately floating orbs of red flesh and horns, dominated by massive tooth-filled maws and a single green eye. They rushed forward eagerly, driven by hunger, and the urging of a great 12-foot-tall red-skinned behemoth, that shook the earth with its cloven hoof tread. Then suddenly, they paused. Sniffing the air, the creatures grew confused at the change in the psychic odor coming from within the structure. The sweet smells of misery, pain and horror, were being overwhelmed by a new scent, one the monsters knew well: rage. Pure, all-consuming, apocalyptic, rage. The kind of rage that, while quite familiar to their kind, was all but unheard of in mortals, as few, if any mortals, had the constitution to even survive it. Indeed, so strong was the scent that several of the monsters grew disoriented, wondering if another of their kind had already killed the source of the despair and pain they had smelled a moment ago. Then, a figure stepped through the destroyed door of the structure. He looked mortal enough, but every one of the monsters present sensed that something was wrong. Soundtrack, Who Taught You How to Hate, by Disturbed. The mortal moved through the door frame with the calm gait of one from whom fear has been utterly erased. His clothes were torn, his face and body covered in cuts and bruises, and his hands were stained with blood. But in his eyes, all the malice, hatred, and raw fury of the damned, was reflected in a pair of crimson orbs that seemed almost to glow in the charnel light filtering down from the raging heavens. In his right hand he held a sword made of black steel, that shimmered faintly with a strange, nearly invisible, golden white light. Raising the blade, the mortal let out a roar that spoke of a level of fury that even the monsters surrounding him balked at. Then he charged. The first to die was one of the smaller monsters, its spindly brown body sliced apart from groin to head, neatly bisecting it. Pivoting on one foot, the mortal did not savor his kill, as he cut one of the ebon-skinned giants in half at the waist effortlessly. Before running to impale another through its skull, then spinning to drive the sword two-handed into the belly of a third, pulling it free as the beast collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. The cuts of the sword spilled no blood, cauterizing the wounds inflicted as if it was made of white-hot flame, the edges of the cuts glowing like coals in a forge. The corpses not long after falling, sloughed into piles of ash, and with each kill, one of the golden runes on the sword's fuller lit up. The radiant glow about the blade was also swiftly becoming brighter and more intense. Though what that indicated, neither the savage mortal nor the monsters could have said. Letting out another wrath-filled roar, the mortal leapt up and decapitated another of the ebon giants with a savage, barely controlled swing. The blade flared brilliantly, and a spider web of glowing golden lines, like the cracks in an old porcelain vase, grew out beneath the monster's skin from the stump of its neck. With unearthly speed the lines swiftly encompassed the creature's entire body, glowing brighter and brighter with every second. Until, with a sharp cracking sound, the monster's body, and head, exploded into clouds of ash, the sword's radiant light growing even stronger, as another rune was lit. Reacting to the unexpected attack at last, one of the floating cyclops orbs spat a ball of blazing psychoactive fire at the mortal from its obscene perpetually grinning mouth. Caught off guard and unable to dodge, the mortal held the blade in a defensive stance at the last possible second, a futile effort. Or so one would have thought. The ball of sizzling energy should have burned through both the sword and the mortal behind it without stopping. Instead, it exploded against a nearly invisible shimmering hemisphere of force, conjured seemingly from nowhere. Ignoring his miraculous escape, the mortal hurtled forward once again. Moving into a spin with his arm and blade outstretched, he sliced through the bellies of 3 of the ebon-scaled brutes at once, discorporating them almost instantly as they tried to surround him. The strange sword now glowed like a second sun, the blade enveloped in pure white light as it turned monster after monster into dust. Twirling like a dervish, the mortal slammed his blade into one of the giant's torso before ripping it out the creature's side to strike the head from another, their bodies bursting into clouds of gray particles a second later. A pair of the gibbering brown and purple-skinned monsters frantically threw a barrage of fireballs at the mortal as he ran toward them. But once more the mortal placed the blade in a defensive position, continuing his charge as he did so. The blast of unholy flame spattering against the same, nearly invisible hemisphere as before, to no visible effect. Reaching the first of the vile duo, the mortal grabbed it by the throat, hoisting it into the air before drawing the blade through the creature's pitifully flailing body, with no more difficulty than if the monster had been made of mist. Just as the creature was about to discorporate into dust, the mortal threw it at its fellow, causing it to flinch and lose control of the flame orb it had been charging. Blinded by the ashen remains of its former confederate, the monster never saw the strike that killed it. It only felt a moment of searing heat across its chest as it was cut in two, and a single instant of incalculable agony as what passed for its soul was ripped apart and pulled from its body. The runes on the sword flickering, as it absorbed the energy. Darren's body fought, as his consciousness watched through tear-stained eyes, from the abyss within his own mind. However, despite the sight of his family's killers dying in droves, his pain only grew greater. It had nothing to do with regretting the deaths of the monsters before his eyes. No, he was very much enjoying watching these vile creatures die, but the realization that it was his own hand that was doing it, drove home a terrible reality. He thought he had been giving his best to his family, the maximum of which he was capable. But he had not. His family had been in danger. What good son, what good husband, what good father? Held back at such a time? If he loved his family, if he had had this power inside him, why was he unable to save them? There were only two answers Darren could think of, as he watched the consciousness guiding his body, cleave open one of the hideous horn-covered orbs of red flesh that had foolishly gotten too close. Either he had not truly loved his family, or he was simply too weak to access this power. Too weak. Too weak to save his father, too weak to save his mother, too weak to save Kira, and too weak to save Teresa. His little girl. The purest, most innocent thing in his life. And when she needed him most, he had failed her. Fresh tears came to Darren's eyes as he felt pain envelop him once more. Teresa, Kira, I'm so sorry. Forgive me. He called out, his cry swiftly transitioning into screams of pain and self-loathing, that echoed through the darkness in his mind. The Baron had had enough. It had watched from afar as its worthless slaves had failed to kill the mortal with a strange sword. After such a pitifully weak display, he would personally torture any who survived to death, and then dine on their souls and meat. The thought brought a smile to the 12-foot-tall Baron's twisted visage, as it stalked forward to show this errant fly its place. First, the Baron would pull the pitiful mortal's arms off, then its legs, then it would see how long it took for the mortal to bleed out. As tortures when it wasn't exactly the most inspired, but away from its master's palace it was forced to work with what it had. Speaking of the masters, the Baron hoped none of them had seen the failure of its troops. They were always watching, and any weakness among their armies was punished severely. Failure to the masters was the only true crime there was in hell. Moving toward the mortal and the glowing sword, the Baron snatched up an imp that had been unable to get out of the way quickly enough. Crushing the imp's torso in one massive paw, the Baron bit off its head as the imp screamed in pain, savoring the taste of demonic blood and brain for a moment, before swallowing and casually casting the lifeless corpse aside. Enjoyable though it was to devour the weaker slaves, the Baron, like all its unholy kind, far preferred the taste of mortal flesh and souls. This mortal's soul seemed particularly strong. It would make for fine dining. Darren's body fought on, monster after monster, kill after kill. It kept going. It was covered in dozens of cuts, scrapes, and burns. Its lungs felt like they were on fire, and its arms and legs were like lead weights. But it kept going. The style of fighting was savage and inelegant, having only a passing resemblance to the swordsmanship Darren had been taught during basic. None of the moves were planned, and his stance was in a constant state of flux. The mind controlling Darren's body, clearly fought on instinct and raw savagery alone. It seldom spoke, and when it did it was usually just to roar out its wrath, or scream out a threat. None of the lesser creatures had thus far managed to stop its rampage, though they gamely kept trying, launching themselves at the red-eyed mortal in a suicidal attempt to bring him down. Where the consciousness in Darren's body was getting the strength to keep up the fight, even it did not know. Any other being would have fallen long ago, too exhausted to go on. Abruptly, however, Darren's body was granted a reprieve, the monsters withdrawing to form a ring around it. As what could only be this pack of abominations' leader, showed itself. It was a giant, At nearly the height of a single-story office building, it towered over even the 7-foot, black-scaled horrors, its fiery red hide bulging with muscle. Its misshapen head was mounted on a neck as thick as a man's torso, two massive ribbed black horns, jutting out from either side of the monster's skull. A pair of beady eyes, like pits in its head, were placed above a mouth filled with mismatched needle-like teeth. Arms like gnarled tree trunks ended in fists the size of wrecking balls, while its auto-carriage-sized torso was covered in muscles that resembled armor plating. It moved with a savage sort of swagger, clearly unimpressed with a lowly mortal before it, as it wreathed its hands in green balefire, and issued a challenging roar. The consciousness in Darren's body roared back, its rage rising to new heights. This monster was the leader. This was the thing that had taken his family. It must die. Darren's body ran forward screaming its defiance, only to jump back as a ball of flame streaked through the spot it had been a moment ago. Glancing around, the entity directing Darren's physical form glanced in the direction the fire had come from. All around him, the brown and purple-skinned creatures were charging orbs of infernal flame. Their master having no intention of giving Darren's body a fair fight, they planned to hold the entity in one place by forcing him to dodge constantly, slowly chipping away at him, till their leader could administer a final blow. The Baron laughed. It was an ugly sound. Like a massive sewage pipe filled with razor wire clearing its throat. It laughed as the mortal realized, that in the army of hell, honor was a sin, not a virtue. It laughed as the puny creature, clad only in rags and wielding an oversized torch, dodged around the fusillade of hellfire blasts hurled by its chittering slaves. It laughed as it saw the mortal get burned by a near miss and stagger slightly. And it abruptly stopped laughing. When it looked into the mortal's eyes, an unfamiliar feeling crept into the Baron's mind. It was faint, and only lasted for a second, but it was enough that the Baron paused, its laugh cut short. Its slaves turned to stare at the Baron curiously, hesitating for just an instant. That was all the opening the mortal needed. The Baron only realized the cost of that brief hesitation when the mortal began running toward it with a rage-fueled burst of speed. Its sword blazing with an energy that, as it got closer, caused the Baron to feel the same sensation that had made it pause in the first place. A sort of chill that jumbled its thoughts and made its eyes unconsciously widen. Roaring in surprise, the Baron threw ball after ball of balefire at the mortal, suddenly desperate to kill him. The chilling sensation growing stronger as the mortal opted not to block the projectiles, but to strike them from the air, its glowing blade seemingly absorbing the unholy flames. The Baron backpedaled. Had it been mortal, it would have known the name of the strange emotion, that now froze its body. As the mortal leapt into the air, its sword raised high, glowing like a shard of the sun, as its eyes blazed with the sanguine red of rage incarnate. It was one of the oldest and most powerful emotions that existed, older than greed, older than jealousy, older even than rage. Its name was fear. The consciousness in Darren's mind was ignorant of many things. It was not a complicated creature, nor did it desire to be. However, it knew one thing with absolute certainty: it had had a family, a happy home, an incredible wife, and a beautiful daughter, that it had loved and been loved by in return. And these monsters had taken that from it. They had to die. They needed to die. Every last one. As the consciousness used Darren's body to jump into the air, it channeled every last iota of its rage into the swing of its upraised sword, and made but a single wish, on behalf of the family it had lost. "Kill them all," it whispered, as it plunged the blade into the chest of the red-skinned monstrosity before it. And the world around it became a nova of light. Darren awoke an unknown amount of time later, to the same roiling black and red clouds he had seen earlier. Staring at the sky, he tried to move, and was surprised to find himself back in control of his body. His muscles felt like they were on fire, he was covered in cuts and burns, and every breath was like inhaling acid, but he was still able to move. However, in his soul, he felt completely empty, and stared at the world through the eyes of a man who no longer truly lived. There was no sign of the horde of monsters that had surrounded him, save for dozens of piles of ash, that were already being blown away by a foul-smelling wind. In his hand was the sword. Unmaker. It no longer glowed, but was still as pristine and unmarred as if it had never been used since its forging. Then Darren's eyes fell on his home, and the tears came again. After a moment of agonized reflection, Darren glanced at the sword again, and for a single instant, wondered if death might offer the solace vengeance had not. Plus that wasn't revenge. Plus Darren started, his eyes going wide as a voice spoke directly into his mind. The voice was startlingly similar to his own, but deeper, darker, and filled with a barely contained wrath that made it almost bestial sounding. "Who are you?" Darren asked, glancing around before recalling that he had heard this voice before. When it had spoken using his mouth. Plus I'm not sure. I thought my name was, Darren Grandel. But that doesn't seem right for some reason. Plus the voice responded, sounding as angry as it did uncertain. "Because that is my name." "Who? Or rather, what are you?" Darren asked, feeling slightly frantic. "Plus what are you so scared for? It ain't like we can lose any more than we already have." Plus the voice lamented spitefully. That observation was like a punch to the gut, draining all the fight from Darren in an instant, and he swiftly found himself in a sitting position as his legs gave out, the sword dropping beside him. No longer caring what the voice was, where it had come from, or even what it cared to call itself. "Yes," Darren agreed, as he buried his face in his hands, wanting desperately to forget all that had transpired. After a long moment, Darren spoke again. Deciding that whether he had succumbed to lunacy or not, talking to this voice was at least better than reflecting on the searing agony in his heart. "What do you mean that wasn't revenge?" Darren asked, not even sure how much he cared. "Plus that thing. It wasn't in charge, just a field commander, and even that's giving it more credit than it deserves. It's called a Baron of Hell, but it ain't got much of a barony." Plus the voice replied, hate in every syllable. "How can you possibly know that?" Darren inquired, suddenly suspicious. "Plus no fucking clue, but if I had to guess, I think it was that sort of hours. While I was fighting I got these. I dunno, memories. I started knowing shit I didn't before, like the names of those monsters. Little ones are imps, bigger ones are hell knights, red floating bastards with the big mouths are cacodemons, and the brick shithouse looking mothers are barons of hell." Plus the voice explained, its tone sounding as if it resented Darren's ignorance. Darren glanced at the sword for a moment, and felt his head swim. In the steel, he saw, for just an instant, a face that was not his own. Like his voice it seemed similar, but with bright blonde hair and glaring red eyes that oozed with a near psychotic bloodlust. Then, as swiftly as it had appeared, the apparition vanished. "Demons. These things. They are demons?" he asked, now quite certain he had gone utterly mad, yet unable to find a compelling reason to fight against it. "Plus give the man a prize. Plus," said the voice, its sarcasm tinged with spite. "Plus yeah, that's exactly what they are." Plus staring in the direction of the capital, Darren suddenly realized what the pillar of red light that dominated the skyline actually was. A portal? But who would have? Darren stopped short as he once more recalled his father's words. "The king," Darren declared, feeling anger bubble up within him for a moment, before despair once more took over. "Is this the end of the world?" Darren asked, his voice as hollow as his heart, not really caring what the answer to his question was. "Plus I dunno. But it sure looks like it." Plus the voice replied, its tone grim, but uncaring. "Plus but even if it is, we got work to do." Plus Darren laughed at that, a sardonic bitter laughter, devoid of even the faintest trace of joy. "Work?" he asked, laughing at the sheer insanity of the statement. "What work could we possibly have to do? Rotate the crops? Drive off the deer? Or perhaps bring our harvest to the unholy conflagration of ruin that was once the capital city?" Darren snarled angrily, tears once more leaking from his eyes. "Plus getting our revenge!" Plus the voice snarled, its tone brimming with venom. Darren suddenly went silent before shaking his head. "Revenge?" he asked softly, a note of spite entering his tone. "Against what?" Plus against the demon's exclamation mark plus the voice roared, causing Darren to flinch at the sheer hatred in its tone. You want to take revenge on a race that is literally endless in number, and cares nothing for its losses? Darren asked, with a humorless smile. Plus their leaders then exclamation mark plus the voice shouted back its fury undiminished. Darren shook his head. What logic is there in such a pointless quest? Darren asked, his voice a hopeless whisper. Plus and what's your plan question mark plus the voice growled. Plus kill yourself right here and now. Hide away, hope this blows over, and live off your inheritance as an empty shell. Or maybe just wait here until one of the demons does what you don't have the balls to? Plus Darren suddenly felt uncertain, as the voice continued. Plus name one thing we have left that's worth living for. Plus Darren was silent, unable to think up an answer. Plus that's what I fucking thought exclamation mark plus the voice snarled. Plus no matter what we do, it's a suicide mission. The only thing we get to decide is what form our death takes. I'd rather die on my feet killing as many of the bastards responsible for this as I can reach, than by slit wrists, or loneliness. How about you question mark plus for a long moment, Darren sat there, considering the question, then slowly he got to his feet. Retrieving Unmaker, he stared at his reflection in the steel, then his expression hardened. I know it was you who killed these demons, Darren stated, glancing at the piles of ashes surrounding them. Do you truly believe you can kill the rest? Darren asked, his tone filled with a cold fury. Darren could not have said how, but he somehow knew that the voice was nodding. Plus yes. If you're willing to commit to it all the way. Plus the voice replied. Darren stood silently for several minutes, then made his decision. Very well then. But first. There is something I must do, Darren stated solemnly, as he headed toward the house. Soundtrack, Dead Man Walking by War Hall. Darren's task was performed in grim silence, his face displaying no more emotion than a corpse. Moving through the house, he hauled out the remains of the demons he had killed, tossing them into a ditch that abutted the main yard. Then, returning to his home, he entered the basement. After a brief search he pulled an old chest from among piles of dusty boxes and shelves of junk. The chest was large, made of heavy-duty green plastic covered in scratches and dents, and fastened with a padlock. The chest contained 2 items Darren had kept mostly out of nostalgia, never imagining he would ever use them again. They had been a sort of gift from his CO, who had joked at the time that Darren could give them to Kira as a wedding present. After unlocking the chest with the key he retrieved from its hiding place in an old vase on a nearby shelf, Darren pulled out the contents of the chest with a feeling of grim acceptance. Comedian Mega Armor, the name was theatrical but apt. A sealed suit made of enchanted metal plates, over semi-self-repairing ensorcelled Kevlar, it could turn bullets, knives, minor magic blasts, and even the claws of wild beasts. The armor was also sealed against a variety of environmental contaminants, and even resisted radiation to a degree. It was an old model, practically an antique, in the standard big green as the grunts called the color. But despite its age, it was solid, robust, and both it and the MageTech power cell were guaranteed to last. Silently donning the armor, Darren maglocked the helmet to his belt, then holstered the other item the box had held. A standard issue MRK-6 blast pistol covered in scratches from years of use, but still in good working order. Before heading back upstairs. Upstairs Darren began the next, and far more painful part of his task. His last duty as a husband, a son, and a father. Slowly, reverently, and with infinite care, he gathered up the remains of his family. Wrapping each of their bodies lovingly in white linen sheets from head to toe. They weren't much, but they were the best funerary shrouds he could offer. Freshly laundered, they smelled of lavender. Kira's favorite scent. Positioning the carefully wrapped bodies side by side in the living room, Darren paid his last respects. Atop his mother's shroud, Darren placed a dried flower that had been in a vase in the living room, a sunflower. Her favorite, as they were a symbol of happiness. Darren was surprised to have found it intact, but apparently the energies of hell were unable to kill what was already dead. With his father, Darren left the Night Sentinel's box that had contained Unmaker, whispering a thank you for the gift that had saved his life. With Kira, Darren left a holodisc containing all her favorite songs. And a last tearful kiss, placed upon her cold lips. Finally, within the wrapping that held Teresa, Darren placed a picture he had found beneath the remains of the coffee table. A stick figure familial portrait, done in crayon. Each figure clearly labeled in a child's untidy scrawl. Me? Grandpa. Garami. Mommy. And finally, Daddy. Then, the bodies prepared and the offerings given, Darren headed to the garage. Searching for a bit, Darren found the big battered can of kerosene that he used to start bonfires in the fall after clearing the seasonal brush out of the yard, and spent the next few minutes thoroughly dousing the house and the area around the bodies, with its contents. Once the can was empty, Darren grabbed a box of matches and headed to the doorframe. For a few minutes he simply stood there, basking in the memories of happier times. The old wooden chest, on which sat the holobox and Teresa's collection of cartoon holovids. The scorch mark on the rug from the time Darren had attempted to create a romantic candlelit scene for Kira, and almost burned the house down. The painting on the wall that had been a valuable antique from Darren's parents, before Teresa had gotten hold of it and made some improvements with her watercolors. Darren thought he had cried all he could have, yet his eyes were wet as he lit the match and threw it into the glistening liquid pooled on the floor. The fire spread rapidly, following the trail of combustible moisture to every corner of the house. Soon, it was a raging inferno. Darren watched in silence, until the smoke and flame obscured all within the structure from view. However, as he turned to leave, he paused, and looked down at his right hand. For a time, Darren stood there, staring blankly at his open hand, before disengaging his gauntlet. Pulling it off. He stared at the object on his middle finger. It was nothing fancy, just a simple unadorned band of gold, however to Darren Grandel, its value was inestimable. It was the last piece of his old world, the last fragment of who he had been, it was all the good things and happy moments in his life wrapped into a single object. With a slow deliberate action, Darren removed the ring. This ring should never have been his. He now knew this with absolute certainty. It had been meant for another man. A stronger man. A wiser man. A man who would have been there when his family needed him most. It belonged to a better man. Because a better man. A better man. Could have saved you, Darren whispered, fresh tears falling from his eyes, as he tossed the ring into the flames. Then, fastening his helmet in place, Darren turned, and walked away. Toward the city. Toward the demons. Toward his doom. Over 1,200 years and an uncountable number of battles removed from his past, Darren Grandel awoke. He was not quite certain what he expected when his mind returned fully to the current era. Sympathy maybe, sadness certainly, questions definitely, these were all expected. Yet, as it so often is, the expected is far from the reality. Here the result was predicted, the intensity was not. Darren was surrounded by sobbing ponies. Not crying, not weeping, sobbing, and each and every one was hugging him as though he might suddenly disappear. They seemed barely able to function, their grief having utterly overwhelmed them as tears poured from their eyes. Darren felt unprepared. He had expected there would be some tears, but not like this. Had they no questions about why in his memories Darren suddenly began addressing someone who was not there? About how he had ended up in Equestria? About anything? Darren shook his head, even as he finally noticed a wetness on his own cheeks. Of course they had questions, of course they wanted answers, but they had forgotten amid a desire that was far more powerful. To Darren, this was yet another example of why humans were, for all their accomplishments, still unable to match the Seraphs and their children. Where humans would have perhaps shed a few tears, and then demanded answers, ponies grieved for those they had never even known. Humans grieved of course, but rarely did they feel true loss for those they did not personally know. Here, Twilight, Celestia, Luna, Starlight, Cadence, Applejack, Fluttershy, Shining Armor, Rainbow Dash, Pinkie Pie, Rarity, and even Spike, all clung to him and cried their eyes out. Not for what they had lost, but for what he had lost. Even Starlight, Celestia, and Luna, who already had the story seared indelibly into their brains, wept bitter tears for Darren. Even though they, of all ponies, should have known better. For even if his family deserved their tears, he most certainly did not. He did not deserve their words of kindness, nor their heartfelt gestures of love and warmth. Darren's past was not the tragic backstory of a hero. No verse to the saga of he who would slay the dragon, rescue the fair maiden, and live happily ever after. That was the story the kind hearts of the Seraphs and their children imagined for him. But it was not his story. No phoenix rose from the ashes of the last day of Dnua, the last day that Darren Grandel walked in the grace of the light. What was born that day, was neither hero nor savior. It was a monster, wrought from the blackest pits of hatred and wrath. And in its wake, there would be only despair. There it is! Apple Bloom cried out, as she sighted the crystal spires of Twilight's castle. Behind her came Scootaloo, and Sweetie Belle, both panting and grim-faced with determination. Both had heard the story from Apple Bloom, about how Darren had suddenly acted like an entirely different person, and then headed straight for Twilight's castle like an enraged manticore. Then, not long afterward, Applejack had failed to come home after her meeting with the Friendship Council. Unable to get any answers from Granny Smith or Big Mac, Apple Bloom had swiftly called an emergency meeting of the Cutie Mark Crusaders, in hopes of determining a sound course of action. Ultimately, however, the only thing they could agree upon, was that they needed more information, and thus had set out for Twilight's castle at the gallop. Well, I don't think there's any pony outside. No, wait. Some pony just came out, Scootaloo cried out, pointing from atop her scooter at the gray-coated mare, who had just exited the castle gate. Is that Derpy? Sweetie Belle asked in confusion. What's she doing here? I dunno, but let's go ask her. Apple Bloom declared, a determined ring in her voice. However, no sooner had the words left Apple Bloom's mouth, than Derpy flapped her wings and flew off toward the wide field across the road. The massive field abutted Ponyville, dividing the town from Sweet Apple Acres, and terminating at the Everfree Forest. Oddly, Derpy hung low in the sky, almost as if she was trying to avoid being seen, or, more likely, to minimize risk to the odd bundle she seemed to be carrying. Scoots, quick! Go flag her down before she gets too far away! Sweetie Belle cried out. Scootaloo nodded. On it! She replied, her wings buzzing like a miniature propeller as she shot toward Derpy in a cloud of dust. Following in Scootaloo's dusty wake, Apple Bloom wondered if they shouldn't have continued to the castle. Then again, Darren had been acting very strange when last she saw him, and she didn't want to go in blind. Once they learned what Derpy knew, they would be better informed on how to proceed. The chase with Derpy lasted several minutes. As fast as Scootaloo was, being on the ground meant she had to navigate various hazards like errant rocks and briar patches. So catching up to her quarry took longer than if she had been able to fly, but she managed. However, just as she was about to hail Derpy, she hesitated. Something seemed off, but she couldn't say what at first. Then, she recalled the lesson Darren had given her and the other Crusaders. Taking a deep breath, she took another look at Derpy, trying to see what was different. For a few moments she still couldn't place it, then she saw it. As a Pegasus, and the unofficially adopted sister of Rainbow Dash, Scootaloo knew a lot about the individual flight patterns of Pegasi, and other creatures of the air. Every creature that flew, had a particular style, and quirks when they flew, almost like a signature, and no two were alike. On the few occasions Scootaloo had seen it, Derpy's flying had always been slightly erratic. She often dipped the tip of her right wing when she didn't need to, or overcorrected for the breeze. Derpy often wobbled slightly, zigzagging through the air in a sort of squiggly line. Today, however, Derpy's flying was nearly perfect. She moved through the air with an undeniable grace, and her wing placement was immaculate. In truth, the only imperfection was that, at what appeared to be regular intervals, Derpy buzzed her wings, in a way that made Scootaloo think briefly of an insect. For an instant Scootaloo considered letting Derpy go, but then thought better of it. Neither Rainbow Dash nor Darren Grandel ever backed down in the face of the unknown, and neither would she. "Hey Derpy! Can we talk for a second?" For a moment, Scootaloo thought Derpy hadn't heard her, as she continued to fly for a few seconds more, giving no indication that she had heard anything. However, just as Scootaloo was about to call out again, Derpy suddenly dropped her altitude, gliding for a short distance, before landing in between a pair of low hills that blocked her from sight for a few moments. Putting on a burst of speed, Scootaloo came around the curve of one of the hills, and nearly ran smack into Derpy's backside. Skidding to a halt, Scootaloo was surprised when Derpy didn't turn to look at her. Standing like a statue, Derpy didn't say a word as Scootaloo cleared her throat. "Hey Derpy, sorry to bother you, but have you seen Darren?" Derpy said nothing, then after waiting for about a minute, Scootaloo tried again. "You know, Darren? Big stallion, saved Ponyville, only one of his kind in Equestria?" Again Derpy remained silent. "Are you okay?" Scootaloo asked, moving a little closer to the gray mailmare, just as Apple Bloom and Sweetie Belle showed up. "Good," Apple Bloom stated, through her exhausted panting. "You found her?" Fanning herself with a hoof to no real effect, Sweetie Belle nodded. "She? Know what happened?" Sweetie panted. But, before Scootaloo could respond, Derpy spoke. However, it was not the voice of the lovable, slightly klutzy, mailmare the three fillies heard. This voice was female, but deep, cold, arrogant, and cruel. "You know." The voice drawled, as a greenish glow around their hooves rooted the three fillies to the spot. "I was rather concerned when I saw you three chasing after this idiot. I thought I might have been discovered. But on reflection, I think this will work out well for me." The three fillies felt their blood run cold, and a chill run up their spines as the voice continued. "I want you to deliver a message to that thing called Darren Grandel." Here Derpy turned, and the Crusaders gasped. Derpy's eyes were now a sickly neon green, that glowed faintly even in broad daylight. While around her neck, the trio saw a pendant made of what looked like black resin. In the center of the pendant was a small green gem, that glowed with the same poisonous radiance as Derpy's eyes. Also around her neck, was a swaddling cloth, that held the quietly sleeping form, of none other than Flurry Heart. Glaring at them, the arrogant voice coming from Derpy continued. "Once you wake up, tell him I have Cadence and Shining Armor's precious little foal. And that if he, or the princesses, ever want to see the brat alive and in one piece again, then he'll be here at exactly midnight to receive further instructions." The next thing the Crusaders saw was a flash of green, then they fell heavily to the ground, instantly unconscious. As the thing in Derpy's body turned, and continued inexorably toward the Everfree, a cruel smile on its stolen features.